Hi guys, imagine a man so committed to his own freedom that he spat in the face of the highest honour the world could offer, turning down the Nobel Prize because he refused to be defined by anyone but himself. This is the story of Jean-Paul Sartre, a chain-smoking, cross-eyed philosopher who became a global rock star of the intellect, challenged the Nazis, reshaped how we think about existence, and lived a love life so complex it still confuses people today. In this series, we're going to deep dive into the mind of the man who told us that hell is other people, exploring his radical life from his lonely childhood to the streets of Paris where he became a revolutionary icon, starting right now with the boy who was made of words. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next, and tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. It all begins in the fading elegance of Belle Époque Paris in 1905, a city on the verge of the modern era but still clinging to the stiff traditions of the 19th century, where Jean-Paul Sartre was born into a family that was reputable, bourgeois, and deeply entrenched in the intellectual fabric of France. Specifically the Schweitzer family, which you might recognise because his cousin was the famous Albert Schweitzer, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, establishing a legacy of brilliance and high expectations that hung over young Jean-Paul from his very first breath like a heavy velvet curtain. But the defining moment of his early life wasn't his birth, but a death, specifically the death of his father, Jean-Baptiste Sartre, a naval officer who contracted a fever in Indochina and died when Jean-Paul was just 15 months old. A tragedy that seems terrible on paper, but one that Sartre later claimed was the greatest stroke of luck he ever had because it meant he grew up without a traditional father figure to impose the law, leaving him with no superego to fight against, just a wide-open path to define himself without the crushing weight of paternal authority. His mother, Anne-Marie, was left a young widow with very few options in a society that didn't favour single women. So she packed up her life and her toddler and moved back into her parents' home, a massive book-filled apartment where Jean-Paul, nicknamed Poulou, became the centre of the universe for his doting mother and his formidable grandfather, Charles Schweitzer. Charles was a larger-than-life character, a German language teacher with a booming voice, a flowing beard, and a theatrical personality who treated his grandson not like a child to be disciplined, but like a miniature adult, a genius in the making, and a wonder to be displayed to guests, creating an environment where young Sartre learned very quickly that performing, acting smart, and using big words was the key to getting love and attention, effectively turning his childhood into a constant stage play where he was the star. This odd upbringing created a boy who felt like an impostor, a child who was constantly playing a role because he had no father to tell him who he really was, or to cut him down to size, leading him to find his true identity not in people, but in the massive library of his grandfather, a sanctuary where he taught himself to read at a shockingly young age, and where he began to view the world not as a collection of physical objects, but as a universe made entirely of words and stories. He was a small, somewhat frail child, and he wasn't considered traditionally handsome, which further pushed him into the world of the mind, where he could be a hero, a swashbuckling adventurer, or a great writer. Fantasies that he acted out in the solitude of that apartment, laying the groundwork for his future belief that we are nothing but what we make of ourselves, a concept that would later shake the world. He would spend hours lying on the rug, devouring encyclopedias and novels, reading Madame Bovary and adventure stories, feeling that the authors were speaking directly to him, and deciding very early on that writing was the only way to justify one's existence. A kind of religious calling for a boy who was raised in a secular, somewhat indifferent household regarding actual religion, where God was just another character in a book rather than a terrifying judge. His grandfather Charles encouraged this, showing off Poulou's scribblings to visitors, calling him a prodigy, which inflated the boy's ego to massive proportions, but also terrified him because he felt he had to keep up the charade of being brilliant, leading to a deep-seated anxiety about authenticity that would later become the cornerstone of his philosophy of existentialism. The house was suffocating in its bourgeois comfort, a place of heavy furniture and hushed voices, where appearances meant everything, and young Jean-Paul observed the adults around him playing their social roles, the polite smiles, the fake interest, the structured manners, and he began to see it all as a kind of theatre, a bad play where everyone was lying to themselves, a realization that sowed the seeds of his later concepts of bad faith, and his intense hatred for the hypocrisy of the upper classes. He didn't go to a real school immediately, instead being tutored at home, which isolated him from other children and made him socially awkward. A little prince trapped in a tower of books, desperate for connection, but only knowing how to interact through the intellect, making his eventual entry into the public school system a harsh collision with reality, where he realized he wasn't the center of the world and that other kids didn't care about his grandfather's library. It was during these formative years that the duality of his nature formed, the desire to be famous and recognized, and the intense need to be free from the expectations of others, a conflict that started with his grandfather's overbearing love and would eventually lead him to the global stage where he would reject the Nobel Prize because he refused to be institutionalized. He wrote later in his autobiography the words that he began his life as he would end it, amidst books, and that the library was the world caught in a mirror, a place where he could control reality, unlike the messy, unpredictable world outside where other children were rough and confusing and didn't understand his references to high literature. This isolation was compounded by a physical issue that developed in his childhood, a wandering eye caused by an illness, which eventually led to his famous strabismus, a disfigurement that made him feel ugly and further alienated him from the easy social acceptance other kids had, forcing him to rely even more on his wit, his voice, and his incredible capacity to think faster than anyone else in the room to win people over. This was the incubator for the genius of the 20th century, a fatherless boy raised by a grandfather who treated him like a prop, surrounded by literature, convinced of his own genius yet feeling like a total fraud, desperate to create a work of art that would make him real, because in his child's mind, if he didn't write, he didn't exist. He wasn't just a boy named Jean-Paul. He was a project, a creation of the Schweitzer household, and his rebellion against being a good little bourgeois boy would fuel his entire career, driving him to dismantle the very class structure that had pampered him, turning the tools of his education against the society that built them. So, as we look at this small boy in 1910's Paris, pretending to read books he couldn't understand just to please his grandfather, we see the raw materials of the philosopher who would later challenge the entire world to take responsibility for their own lives, proving that even a pampered, lonely child could grow up to shake the foundations of society. But first, he had to survive the brutal awakening of growing up and the sudden intrusion of a new man who would threaten his paradise, his stepfather. This intrusion into his perfectly constructed world of mother-son worship would shatter his reality and force him to confront the fact that he was just a superfluous object in a chaotic world, a realization that is terrifying for a child, but essential for the making of an existentialist, marking the end of the golden era of Poulou and the beginning of the turbulent adolescence of Jean-Paul. The golden age of being the adored little prince in the Schweitzer household came to a crashing, devastating halt in 1917 when Sartre was 12 years old, a year that marked the end of his childhood paradise, because his mother, Anne-Marie, committed the ultimate betrayal in his eyes by remarrying, choosing a man named Joseph Mancy, who was everything the young Jean-Paul was not, and everything he would grow to despise. Joseph Mancy was a naval engineer, a man of science, rigid discipline, and heavy practical reality, with a thick moustache and a belief in order and hierarchy that clashed violently with the whimsical literary world Jean-Paul had built for himself, effectively dethroning Poulou from his position as the centre of his mother's universe and forcing him to share her affection with a stranger who looked at him not as a genius, but as a spoiled, weird little boy who needed to be toughened up. To make matters worse, the family moved from the intellectual, vibrant heart of Paris to the coastal town of La Rochelle, a provincial, rugged place that felt like a prison to the young Parisian, where the local boys were rough, interested in fighting and sports, and had zero patience for a cross-eyed, articulate intellectual who dressed like a little gentleman and spoke like a walking dictionary. This move to La Rochelle was the first time Sartre truly encountered the other, the gaze of people who didn't love him. And it was brutal because for the first time, he was judged not by his clever thoughts, but by his physical appearance and his lack of physical prowess, leading to relentless bullying that made him acutely aware of his own ugliness and physical inadequacies. He was small, he had that wandering eye which made it look like he was looking in two directions at once, and he was socially awkward. So the local kids tore him apart, beating him up and ostracizing him, which drove him into a deep, seething resentment against the mindless conformity of the group, and further solidified his feeling of being an outsider, a stranger in a hostile world. In a desperate attempt to win the approval of these rough classmates, or at least to buy their tolerance, young Sartre began stealing money from his mother's purse to buy them sweets and treats. A pathetic gesture of corruption that highlighted just how desperate he was for connection. But naturally he was caught, leading to a humiliation that scarred him deeply and branded him as a thief in his own home, intensifying the Cold War between him and his stepfather. Joseph Mancy tried to fix Jean-Paul, trying to interest him in mathematics and geometry, subjects Mancy loved for their clean logic, but Sartre hated them with a passion, because they represented the cold, mechanical world of his stepfather, pushing him further into literature as an act of rebellion, reading voraciously not just to escape, but to build a fortress against the authority figure he loathed. This period in La Rochelle was essentially the crucible where his hatred for the bourgeoisie was forged, not just as an abstract political concept, but as a personal vendetta against the values Mancy represented: respectability, order, money, and social climbing, all of which Sartre saw as suffocating and fake. He began to see himself as a spy in enemy territory, observing the adults around him with a cynical eye, noting their hypocrisy, their obsession with status, and their fear of anything different, fueling a dark, rebellious streak that would stay with him forever. He was miserable, lonely, and angry, realizing that the love he'd taken for granted from his mother was not absolute, which taught him a hard lesson about the contingency of human relationships and the fundamental solitude of existence, a theme that would later dominate his novels like Nausea. However, this misery had a deadline because his grandfather Charles, realizing that La Rochelle was crushing the boy's spirit and intellect, intervened and arranged for Jean-Paul to return to Paris to attend the prestigious Lycée Henri Jaff as a boarder, a move that saved his life and placed him back in his natural habitat of ideas and debate. Returning to Paris was like breathing fresh air after years of suffocation, and it was at Henri IV that he met a boy who would become his alter ego, his shadow, and his greatest friend, Paul Nizan, a brilliant, angry, and incredibly talented young man who shared Sartre's disdain for the establishment and his hunger for greatness. Nizan was sleek, fashionable, and socially smoother than Sartre, but they connected instantly on an intellectual level, forming a duo that the other students looked at with awe and annoyance, walking the halls like they owned the place, talking a mile a minute about philosophy, literature, and how they were going to change the world. Nizan was the one person who truly understood Sartre, and Sartre later said, "Nizan was me," indicating a level of intimacy and shared identity that was almost romantic in its intensity, providing Jean-Paul with the validation he had lost when his mother remarried. Together they navigated the rigorous competitive world of the French elite education system, which was designed to churn out the leaders of the Republic, sharpening their minds against the best teachers in the country, learning to deconstruct arguments, analyse texts, and write with a precision that was terrifyingly effective. Sartre threw himself into his studies not just to get good grades, but to dominate, to prove that the ugly duckling from La Rochelle was actually a swan of the intellect, developing a staggering work ethic where he would read and write for hours on end, ignoring the need for sleep or food, fueled by coffee and an ambition that was almost frightening in its intensity. He was becoming a learning machine, absorbing Hegel, Kant and Descartes, but always looking for the cracks in their theories, always looking for a way to assert his own freedom against the heavy weight of tradition. The bond with Nizan also politicised him slightly, as Nizan was more attuned to the social injustices of the world, although at this stage Sartre was still largely an anarchist at heart, more interested in individual freedom than collective revolution, wanting to liberate himself before he worried about the workers. By the time he was ready to prepare for the entrance exams to the École Normale Supérieure, the holy grail of French intellectual life, Sartre had transformed from the bullied victim of La Rochelle into a confident, almost arrogant young philosopher who knew he was destined for greatness, armed with a biting wit and a vocabulary that could dismantle anyone who dared to challenge him. He was still the little man physically, but mentally he was becoming a giant, and he began to cultivate a persona of eccentricity, wearing odd clothes, making shocking statements, and deliberately ignoring social conventions to show that he was above the petty rules of society. He was preparing to enter the most exclusive club in France, the ENS, where the competition would be fierce, but he wasn't afraid because he had Nizan by his side, and a burning conviction that he had something new to say to the world, something that would explain the strange, nauseating feeling he sometimes got when he looked at a simple object like a tree root or a glass of beer, a sensation that the world was too much, too present, and utterly without meaning, a feeling he was just beginning to understand as the absurdity of existence. This return to Paris and the alliance with Nizan marked the end of his awkward adolescence and the beginning of his rise as a formidable thinker, setting the stage for the roaring 20s where he would meet the woman who would become the other half of his soul. But before that could happen, he had to conquer the École Normale and prove to the rigorous examiners that he wasn't just a clever boy, but a master of thought. It was a time of intense pressure, late nights, and the forging of a personality that was equal parts brilliance and bravado, as he stood on the precipice of adulthood, ready to devour the world before it could devour him, unaware that the carefree days of student life were about to crash into the reality of a world drifting towards war and chaos, demanding more from him than just clever essays. The stage was set for the prankster of the ENS, a phase where Sartre would become legendary not just for his grades, but for his chaotic sense of humour and his refusal to take anything seriously, masking a deep, terrifying ambition to rewrite the rules of reality itself. Entering the École Normale Supérieure in 1924 was like walking into the Hogwarts of French philosophy, except instead of magic wands, everyone was armed with razor-sharp wit and a terrifying knowledge of ancient Greek. And in this elite hothouse of brilliance, Jean-Paul Sartre didn't just survive, he exploded onto the scene as the undisputed king of chaos, turning the prestigious institution into his personal playground. You might expect a future Nobel Prize winner to be a serious, brooding student locked in a library, but Sartre was actually the class clown, the ringleader of a group of intellectual troublemakers who spent as much time pranking the administration as they did studying metaphysics, earning him a reputation not just as a genius, but as a total wild card. He was short, messy, and loud, often seen wandering the halls in his pyjamas, playing jazz piano, singing songs about philosophy, and organising elaborate practical jokes that would become legendary, the most famous of which involved the aviator Charles Lindbergh, who had just made his historic flight across the Atlantic. Sartre and his friends, sick of the media frenzy, called the newspapers and announced that Lindbergh was coming to the École Normale, and when the press and a massive crowd gathered, a student dressed as Lindbergh appeared on the roof, waving to the cheering masses while Sartre and his gang laughed hysterically at the gullibility of the public, a prank that humiliated the school director and forced him to resign, proving that Sartre's disdain for authority and mass hysteria was already fully formed and operational. But beneath the jokes and the constant partying, Sartre was reading like a man possessed, devouring hundreds of books a year, creating a personal philosophy that was a mix of everything he read but twisted into something new. Yet his arrogance led to a massive stumbling block that would humble him in a way nothing else could. The aggregation exam of 1928. This was the Super Bowl of French academia, the exam that decided who was smart enough to teach in the nation's best schools, and everyone, including Sartre, assumed he would breeze through it and take the top spot. But in a shocking twist that stunned the entire student body, Sartre failed miserably, ranking 50th in a class where only the top few passed. A humiliation that was absolute and crushing because he had been outsmarted by the very system he mocked. The judges later admitted that he failed not because he was stupid, but because he was too original, refusing to give the standard answers they wanted, and instead trying to reinvent philosophy in his exam papers. A noble effort that got him a failing grade while his best friend Nizan passed with flying colours, leaving Sartre behind to repeat the year. But this failure turned out to be the greatest thing that ever happened to him, because it forced him to stay at the school for another year, the specific year 1929, which put him on a collision course with a brilliant young woman who was also preparing for the exam, a woman named Simone de Beauvoir. She was 21, the youngest person ever to attempt the exam, beautiful in a striking, severe way, with blue eyes and a mind so sharp it could cut glass. And from the moment they started talking, the chemistry was explosive, not just physically, but intellectually, creating a fusion of souls that would become the most famous partnership in the history of philosophy. Sartre was captivated by her because she was the first woman he met who was truly his equal, someone who could understand his most complex thoughts and challenge them, and he gave her the nickname Castor, which means beaver in English, partly because Beauvoir sounds like beaver, and partly because she was such a hard worker, a nickname that stuck for the rest of their lives. They spent that summer studying together, walking through the parks of Paris, dissecting the world and falling in love. But this wasn't a normal romance with flowers and promises of a white picket fence, because both of them despised the traditional bourgeois marriage which they saw as a trap that killed freedom and turned love into a duty. So, sitting on a bench near the Louvre, Sartre proposed a radical pact to her, a deal that would define their relationship forever. They would be a couple, but they would never marry, never live together, and never have children, remaining free to have contingent loves, affairs, with other people as long as they were completely honest with each other about everything, creating a relationship of total transparency and total freedom. It was a shocking arrangement for 1929, a time when women were expected to be obedient wives, but Beauvoir agreed because she valued her own freedom as much as his, and thus began a 51-year partnership that was equal parts inspiring and controversial, a duo that would dominate the intellectual landscape of the 20th century. With Beauvoir by his side, sharpening his ideas and disciplining his chaotic mind, Sartre retook the aggregation in 1929, and this time he didn't just pass, he destroyed it, taking first place, while Beauvoir, who had actually been the better student in many ways, took second place, cementing their status as the king and queen of the new generation of thinkers. They emerged from the university not as dusty academics, but as a power couple, ready to take on the world, armed with a new way of thinking and a refusal to bow to social norms. But reality was about to intervene again, as they were assigned teaching posts in different cities, forcing them to navigate their new, open relationship across long distances. This separation was painful, but it tested their pact immediately, pushing Sartre into the grim reality of compulsory military service, where he was drafted into the meteorological corps, a job that involved staring at clouds and measuring wind speed, giving him plenty of time to think about the nature of boredom and freedom while trapped in a uniform he hated. It was during this time of service and his subsequent teaching job in the rainy, grey port city of Le Havre that the playful prankster of the École Normale began to darken, facing the crushing weight of a normal routine life that terrified him, a feeling of nausea that would soon become the title of his first masterpiece. He was a high school teacher now, trying to explain philosophy to bored teenagers who didn't care, living in cheap hotel rooms because he refused to own property, chain-smoking incessantly, and feeling that despite his brilliance, he was trapped in a mundane existence that was slowly suffocating his genius. He needed a breakthrough, a new way to see the world that went beyond the stale French philosophy he had been taught, and he would find it in a cocktail bar in Paris during a visit with his old friend Raymond Aron, who told him about a new kind of philosophy coming out of Germany called phenomenology. Aaron pointed to a glass of apricot cocktail and said, "You see, my little friend, if you are a phenomenologist, you can talk about this cocktail, and that is philosophy." A sentence that struck Sartre like a lightning bolt, because it meant he didn't have to talk about abstract concepts like the good or the truth, but could philosophize about real, tangible things like street lamps, waiters, and drinks, describing the actual experience of living. This revelation sent him rushing to Berlin in 1933 to study this new magic, right as the shadow of Adolf Hitler was rising over Germany, a dark historical context that Sartre, in his obsession with ideas, initially failed to fully understand, focusing on his studies while the world around him began to burn. The stage was set for his transformation from a clever teacher into the philosopher of existence, but first he had to confront the demons of his own mind, which were about to unleash a hallucination-filled nightmare induced by a reckless experiment with drugs that would haunt him for years. Sartre arrived in Berlin in 1933, the very year Adolf Hitler seized absolute power, yet the philosopher was so consumed by his intellectual quest that he practically ignored the swastikas draping the city and the ominous marching in the streets, a political blindness that seems baffling today, but highlights just how obsessed he was with his new toy, phenomenology, spending his days in the French Institute reading Husserl, while the world around him descended into fascism, treating the Nazi rise as mere background noise to his study of consciousness. He was looking for a way to describe the world exactly as it appeared without the filter of abstract theories, but when he returned to France to resume his teaching post in Le Havre, the excitement of Berlin faded into a deep, crushing depression, caused by the realization that he was aging, balding, and still hadn't written the great masterpiece he had promised himself he would create, leading him to a desperate decision in 1935 that would almost cost him his sanity. In an attempt to study the nature of imagination and hallucination for a psychology book he was writing, he agreed to be a guinea pig for a friend at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, and was injected with mescaline, a powerful hallucinogen that he naively thought would give him pleasant visions, but instead it unleashed a hellscape of horror that didn't end when the drug wore off. The room distorted, umbrellas turned into vultures, shoes turned into skeletons, and he was suddenly gripped by a terrifying paranoia that he was being followed by giant lobsters and crabs, a hallucination that persisted for months, haunting him every time he looked over his shoulder, making him fear he was sliding into permanent schizophrenia. These crustaceans became his constant companions, scuttling at the edge of his vision, a manifestation of his fear of being trapped, of the sticky, overwhelming abundance of life that he found repulsive, and he had to fight a daily battle to maintain his grip on reality, while standing in front of a classroom of students, acting like a normal teacher, while terrified that a lobster was about to crawl up his leg. This period of near madness was the crucible that forged his most famous novel, Nausea, because he took all that terror, all that disgust for the physical world, and poured it into the character of Antoine Roquentin, a historian who realizes that existence itself is just a gross, shapeless blob without meaning. There is a famous scene in the book where the protagonist looks at the root of a chestnut tree and suddenly sees it not as a root or wood or black, but as a terrifying naked existence, a soft, monstrous mass that defies description, a realization that makes him physically sick, giving us the term existential nausea. Writing the book was his therapy, his way of exorcising the crabs and imposing order on the chaos of his mind, and it worked, allowing him to claw his way back to sanity, just as the book was accepted by the prestigious publisher Gallimard, instantly catapulting him from an obscure teacher to a literary sensation in 1938. Nausea hit the French literary scene like a bomb, shocking critics with its raw, visceral description of existence and its rejection of all traditional comforts like religion or humanism, declaring that we are condemned to be free in a world that doesn't care about us. At 33, Sartre had finally achieved the fame he craved since childhood, becoming the talk of Paris. But the universe has a dark sense of humour, because just as he was tasting success, The history he had ignored in Berlin came crashing down on France with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The dreamer was yanked out of his literary bubble and drafted back into the army. But because of his bad eyesight and lack of physical strength, he wasn't sent to the front lines to fight with a rifle, but was assigned to the Meteorological Corps in Alsace, a bizarre phony war period where there was no actual fighting for months, leaving him stranded in a muddy field with nothing to do but launch weather balloons and think. This strange pause in the war became the most productive period of his life, as the isolation and the proximity to death forced him to stop playing the role of the detached observer and start thinking about what it means to be free in a situation you didn't choose, scribbling thousands of pages in notebooks that would eventually become his philosophical magnum opus, Being and Nothingness. He was no longer the arrogant student or the depressed teacher. He was a soldier in a war that made no sense, surrounded by men from all walks of life, which finally began to chip away at his elitism and opened his eyes to the concept of solidarity, realizing that his individual freedom was inextricably linked to the freedom of others. But the quiet days of the phony war ended abruptly in 1940 with the German Blitzkrieg, which smashed through the French defences in weeks, leading to a chaotic retreat where Sartre, along with millions of others, was captured by the Nazis on his birthday, June 21st, transforming the philosopher of freedom into a prisoner of war. He was marched to a POW camp in Germany, Stalag der Toothiste D, where he was stripped of his identity, his fame, and his comfort, reduced to just a number in a sea of suffering men, a brutal reality check that would test his philosophy to the breaking point. Yet, even behind barbed wire, Sartre refused to be crushed, finding a strange kind of freedom in the camp because, as he later provocatively claimed, we were never so free as under the German occupation, meaning that because every choice was a matter of life and death, every choice was authentic and meaningful, he became a central figure in the barracks, telling stories to keep morale up, even writing and directing a Christmas play for the prisoners that was full of hidden anti-German messages which the guards were too stupid to understand. A moment of defiance that proved that you can lock up a man's body, but you cannot lock up his mind. This experience in the Stalag changed him forever, shifting him from a lonely individualist into a man who understood the power of the collective. But he knew he couldn't stay there forever. He had to get back to Paris to participate in the resistance, so he hatched a plan to escape, using his wandering eye to convince the German doctors that he was going blind and was useless to them as a prisoner. It was a risky gamble, relying on his ability to act and deceive, but it worked, and in 1941 he was released on medical grounds, returning to occupied Paris with a fake ID and a burning desire to fight back, not with guns but with words, unaware that the city he returned to was a shadow of its former self, a place of fear, collaboration, and silence where he would have to navigate a moral minefield to survive and thrive. He reunited with Beauvoir, who had been frantic with worry, and together they founded a resistance group called Socialism and Liberty, trying to unite writers and intellectuals against the Nazis, a naive but brave attempt that showed Sartre was finally ready to get his hands dirty in the real world. The war had killed the crabs of his madness and replaced them with the very real monsters of the Gestapo, setting the stage for his rise as the moral conscience of the resistance. But the path was dangerous and full of compromises that would haunt him later. Returning to Paris in 1941, Sartre found a city that had lost its soul, draped in swastika flags and suffocated by a blanket of silence and fear, where the clacking of German boots on the pavement was the soundtrack of daily life, and every neighbour was a potential informant, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that was the perfect, terrible laboratory for his philosophy of freedom. He immediately tried to organise resistance with his group Socialism and Liberty, recruiting fellow intellectuals to write pamphlets and gather intelligence. But he quickly realised that writing brilliant essays doesn't stop tanks, and the established resistance groups, particularly the communists, viewed him with deep suspicion, seeing him as a bourgeois amateur playing at revolution rather than a serious fighter. His group eventually dissolved due to lack of support and the sheer danger of operation, a failure that stung Sartre deeply but taught him a crucial lesson: that good intentions aren't enough, and that political action requires organisation and ruthlessness, pushing him closer to the Communist Party even though he wouldn't join them for years. With his direct resistance efforts stalled, he turned back to what he did best: writing, using the theatre as his weapon, penning plays like The Flies, which retold an ancient Greek myth about Orestes and the flies of guilt, a thinly veiled allegory for the German occupation, where he urged the French people to reject the guilt imposed on them by the Vichy government and to seize their freedom, a message that slipped past the German censors who were too uncultured to understand the subtext. It was during these dark years of occupation that he finished his massive philosophical treatise, Being and Nothingness, a 700-page brick of a book that is notoriously difficult to read, but contains the core of his thought: that there is no God, no fixed human nature, and that we are condemned to be free, meaning that we have no excuses for our actions, not even the excuse of "I was just following orders," a radical idea that was a direct indictment of the Nazis and the French collaborators. The book was published in 1943 and surprisingly became a bestseller, not necessarily because everyone understood it, but because it weighed exactly 1 kilogram, making it the perfect weight to use as a counterweight on scales for buying vegetables in the food-scarce black market of Paris, meaning that many people bought Sartre's masterpiece just to weigh their potatoes. While he was writing and teaching, he was also living a double life, navigating the grey zones of occupation, eating at cafes frequented by German officers, and publishing in journals that were technically sanctioned by the censors, a moral ambiguity that some critics would later attack him for, questioning why he didn't grab a gun and shoot Nazis, but Sartre believed his battlefield was the mind of the French people. During this time, the family expanded, not with children, but with a complex web of lovers and friends that revolved around Sartre and Beauvoir, a bohemian court where they held court in the Café de Flore, drinking ersatz coffee and writing all day because the café was heated and their apartments were freezing, turning the café into their office and living room. It was here, amidst the smoke and the whispers of the underground, that he met a man who would become the other great pole of his life, a brooding, handsome writer named Albert Camus, who had just arrived from Algeria with the manuscript of The Stranger in his suitcase, sparking a friendship that was instant and electric. They were opposites in many ways: Sartre the ugly, urban intellectual from the upper class, and Camus the handsome, streetwise kid from the poor working class of Algiers. But they shared a passion for freedom and a hatred of injustice, becoming the dynamic duo of the Paris literary scene, partying together, chasing women, and debating the future of the world late into the night. As the war turned against the Nazis and the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944, the tension in Paris reached a boiling point, and Sartre, energised by the approaching liberation, joined the National Writers' Committee, finally finding a way to integrate his writing with effective political action. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was the moment Sartre had been waiting for all his life. A glorious explosion of joy and chaos where the streets were filled with cheering crowds, American tanks, and the sweet taste of freedom. And Sartre was right in the middle of it, reporting for the newspaper Combat, which Camus was editing, finally living the life of the engaged man of action he had dreamed of. With the Germans gone, a vacuum was left in the soul of France, a desperate need for a new way to think and live after the shame of collaboration and the horrors of the Holocaust. And Sartre stepped into that vacuum like a prophet, offering existentialism not just as a philosophy, but as a lifestyle. Suddenly everyone wanted to be an existentialist. Young people started dressing in black, wearing turtlenecks, smoking pipes, and hanging out in jazz cellars in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, mimicking Sartre's look and attitude, turning a complex philosophy about anxiety and nothingness into a pop culture craze. Sartre became the first global public intellectual, a superstar who was mobbed by photographers wherever he went, his face on the cover of magazines, his ideas debated by people who had never read a word of his books, a level of fame that was intoxicating but also terrifying. Because he was no longer just a writer, he was a guide for a lost generation. He launched his own journal, Les Temps Modernes, Modern Times, named after the Charlie Chaplin movie, declaring in the first issue that literature must be committed, meaning that writers had a moral duty to take sides in political struggles and could no longer hide in ivory towers, effectively declaring war on the old idea of art for art's sake. He was now the most famous philosopher in the world, the Pope of Existentialism, holding court in the cafes of the left bank. But with this massive platform came massive responsibility, and the Cold War was about to force him to choose sides in a way that would tear his friendships apart and tarnish his reputation forever. He travelled to the United States in 1945, reporting on the victorious nation for French newspapers, fascinated by the energy of New York and the jazz clubs of Harlem, but also critical of American racism and consumerism, signalling the beginning of his complicated relationship with the USA. He was at the peak of his powers, loved and hated in equal measure, a man who had survived the war and the crabs and the rejection to become the voice of his age. But the real political battles were just beginning, and his desperate desire to change the world would lead him into a dangerous tango with the Soviet Union that would alienate his best friend Camus and leave a stain on his legacy that remains to this day. The war was over, but the war for the mind of Europe had just begun, and Sartre was ready to be its general, armed with his pen and an unshakable belief that man makes himself. By 1946, Jean-Paul Sartre was no longer just a writer. He was a phenomenon, a brand, and a public menace all rolled into one, sparking a cultural frenzy that the French press dubbed Sartre mania, a level of hysteria usually reserved for movie stars or musicians, not for a 5-foot-tall, wall-eyed philosopher who wrote dense books about ontology. The epicentre of this earthquake was the neighbourhood of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, specifically the smoky jazz cellars and cafes like Les Deux Magots and Café de Flore, where Sartre held court like a king, surrounded by a court of young disciples who hung on his every word, dressed in black turtlenecks, smoked incessantly, and listened to American bebop jazz, creating the stereotype of the beatnik intellectual that would eventually spread to New York and the rest of the world. It got so crazy that tourists would come to the cafes just to stare at him writing, treating him like a zoo animal, which annoyed him but also fed his massive ego, because deep down, the little boy who wanted to be famous was loving every minute of it, even if the serious philosopher found it distracting. The height of this madness occurred in October 1945, when he agreed to give a public lecture titled Existentialism is a Humanism to clarify his ideas, expecting a small crowd of students. But instead, thousands of people stormed the building, breaking windows, crushing furniture, and causing women to faint in the crush, forcing Sartre to fight his way to the podium like a boxer entering the ring. In this speech, which he delivered without notes, he tried to defend his philosophy against the communists who called it contemplative bourgeois navel-gazing, and the Catholics who called it pessimistic filth, arguing that existentialism was actually a positive doctrine of action and responsibility, a simplified version of his thoughts that became his most famous work, but one he later regretted and practically disowned because he felt it was too soft and compromised his rigorous ideas just to please the crowd. While he was conquering Paris, his personal life was becoming even more complicated, because during a trip to the United States in 1945, he met and fell largely in love with a French-American woman named Dolores Vanetti, a passionate affair that seriously threatened his pact with Simone de Beauvoir for the first time. He was captivated by Dolores and the energy of New York, staying in the city for months, showering her with affection, and even contemplating marriage, which would have destroyed the essential love he had with Beauvoir, leading to a period of intense jealousy and anxiety for Castor back in Paris. Beauvoir, however, was not one to sit at home and cry. She responded by embarking on her own intense transnational romance with the American writer Nelson Algren, creating a transatlantic square of love and heartbreak that fueled their writing, but tested the limits of their open relationship to the breaking point. Sartre eventually returned to Paris, choosing his shared intellectual mission with Beauvoir over the domestic happiness Dolores offered, proving that for him, the work and the partnership always came first. But the scars of that choice lingered for years. Back in France, the political clouds were darkening as the Cold War began to freeze Europe into two hostile blocs: the capitalist West led by the USA and the communist East led by the Soviet Union, a geopolitical vice that squeezed independent thinkers like Sartre, who wanted to be neither a capitalist lackey nor a Soviet puppet. He tried to carve out a third way by helping to found a new political party called the RDR, Revolutionary Democratic Rally, hoping to create a non-communist socialist movement that championed freedom without the gulags, a noble dream that attracted thousands of members initially, but was doomed to fail because in the polarised world of 1948 there was no room for nuance. The pressure to choose a side was immense, especially from the French Communist Party, PCF, who were incredibly powerful and viewed Sartre as a dangerous rival for the hearts of the youth, attacking him viciously in their newspapers, calling him a hyena with a fountain pen and a lubricious viper, insults that hurt Sartre deeply because he genuinely wanted to support the working class, which the communists claimed to represent. This political tension began to drive a wedge between him and his best friend Albert Camus, who was becoming increasingly critical of revolutionary violence in the Soviet Union, while Sartre, desperate to be politically effective, was slowly convincing himself that the Communist Party, despite its flaws, was the only vehicle for real change. The failure of the RDR was a bitter pill for Sartre, teaching him that dirty hands were unavoidable in politics, a theme he explored in a play of the same name, where he argued that you cannot govern innocently, and that sometimes you have to compromise your morals for the greater good, a dangerous logic that was leading him straight into the arms of the Stalinists. He was wealthy now, thanks to the royalties from his books and plays, but he gave most of his money away, living in simple hotels, tipping waiters massive amounts, and supporting a small army of friends and ex-lovers, treating money with the same disdain he treated bourgeois manners, viewing it only as a tool to buy freedom for himself and others. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the fun and games of the liberation era were fading, replaced by the grim reality of the Korean War and the intensifying persecution of communists in the West, forcing Sartre to make the most controversial decision of his life, to ally himself with the Soviet Union. He felt that the United States, with its racism, its McCarthyism, and its nuclear threats, was the greater evil, and that despite the rumours of labour camps in Russia, the USSR was the only hope for the proletariat, a conclusion that would cost him his reputation among liberals and destroy his friendship with Camus. He was done being the third-way observer. He was ready to become a fellow traveller, a decision that shocked the world because the philosopher of absolute freedom was about to defend the most totalitarian regime on the planet, a paradox that can only be explained by his intense guilt over being a bourgeois intellectual and his desperate need to be on the side of history, even if history was written in blood. The stage was set for the Great Breakup, the intellectual duel of the century between Sartre and Camus, which would explode over the publication of a single book, dividing Paris and the world into two camps and marking the end of the golden age of their friendship. This was the moment Sartre traded his independence for engagement, convinced that an anti-communist is a dog, a phrase that would haunt him forever as he stepped onto the slippery slope of political extremism, leaving the jazz cellars behind for the grim meeting halls of the far left. The year 1952 marked the detonation of the most famous friendship in literary history, a brutal public divorce between Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus that tore the French intellectual world into two hostile camps and forced everyone to choose a side. A conflict that wasn't just about personal grievances, but about the very soul of the 20th century. The catalyst was the publication of Camus' explosive book, The Rebel, a philosophical attack on totalitarianism and revolutionary violence, where Camus dared to equate the crimes of Stalin with the crimes of Hitler, arguing that no ideology was worth the sacrifice of a human life, and that the Soviet Union had betrayed the revolution by turning it into a police state. For Sartre, who had convinced himself that the Communist Party was the sole vehicle of history and the only hope for the working class, this book was an unforgivable betrayal, a bourgeois cop-out that prioritised abstract morality over the gritty, necessary work of changing the world, and he felt that Camus was effectively siding with the American imperialists by criticising the East. Sartre didn't want to review the book himself, perhaps because he still loved Camus, so he assigned the task to a junior editor at Le Temps Moderne, Francis Janson, who wrote a scathing, condescending review that treated the Nobel-destined Camus like a confused high school student who didn't understand philosophy, a humiliation that sent Camus into a rage. Camus fired back not at Janson, but directly at Sartre, writing a letter addressed to the director that was dripping with hurt and sarcasm, accusing Sartre of being an armchair revolutionary who preached violence from the safety of his desk while ignoring the reality of the gulags. Sartre's response was a literary nuclear bomb, a 20-page open letter published in his magazine that began with the chilling words, "My dear Albert, our friendship is dead," and proceeded to dismantle Camus piece by piece, attacking his competence, his philosophy and his character, telling him, "You're not the centre of the world," and accusing him of being a beautiful soul who preferred to keep his hands clean rather than deal with the dirty reality of politics. It was a savage public execution of a friendship that left both men devastated, with Sartre later admitting that he missed Camus every day, but at that moment the ideological divide was too wide to bridge. Camus chose people over history, and Sartre chose history over people. With Camus gone, Sartre swung violently to the left, entering his fellow traveller phase where he became an apologist for the Soviet Union, a period that many of his admirers today look back on with embarrassment because it led him to say and write things that were objectively untrue in his desperate attempt to support the cause. This radicalisation was triggered partly by the Pigeon affair, a ridiculous incident where the French police arrested a communist leader Jacques Duclos, claiming the pigeons found in his car were carrier pigeons for communicating with Moscow, when in reality they were just squabs for his dinner, an absurdity that convinced Sartre the French government was a fascist police state and that he had to side with the communists at all costs. He wrote a massive series of articles titled "The Communists and Peace," declaring that an anti-communist is a dog, and arguing that the Communist Party was the working class, so to criticise the party was to attack the workers themselves, a logical leap that trapped him in a corner where he had to defend the indefensible. In 1954, he finally visited the Soviet Union, a carefully choreographed propaganda tour where the Soviets treated him like royalty, showing him model factories and happy workers while hiding the labour camps and the poverty, and Sartre, usually the most critical thinker on earth, swallowed it whole because he wanted to believe it was true. When he returned to Paris, he gave an interview to the newspaper Libération, where he made the infamous claim that freedom of criticism is total in the USSR, and that the Soviet citizens didn't travel not because they were forbidden, but because they had no desire to leave their socialist paradise, statements that shocked his friends and made him the laughingstock of the right-wing press. He was blinding himself for the sake of the greater good, believing that if he told the truth about the Soviet failures, he would demoralise the French workers and help the American capitalists, so he chose to lie, a tragic irony for the philosopher of truth and authenticity. He was drinking heavily during this period, using amphetamines to stay awake and write furiously, churning out pages of political theory that were dense, angry, and often contradictory, trying to fuse existentialism with Marxism, a task he compared to mixing oil and water. He was a man possessed, driven by a guilt of being a bourgeois intellectual, trying to wash away his original sin of privilege by throwing himself onto the gears of the revolution, even if it meant crushing his own integrity in the process. Yet, even in this dogmatic haze, his genius flickered. He wrote the play Keane, an adaptation of Dumas, where he explored the idea of the actor and the mask, reflecting his own struggle with his public persona, and he continued to produce brilliant literary criticism, proving that the artist in him was still alive beneath the political hack. But the world is not static, and history, which Sartre worshipped, was about to betray him in the most brutal way possible with the events of 1956, specifically the Soviet invasion of Hungary, a moment that would shatter his illusions and force him to realize that his friends in Moscow were just as imperialist and violent as the Americans he hated. The tanks rolling into Budapest would crush not just the Hungarian resistance, but also Sartre's blind loyalty to the USSR, forcing him into a painful crisis of conscience where he would have to admit that Camus might have been right all along about the nature of the Soviet beast. This was the beginning of his shift away from the Orthodox Communist Party and towards a more independent radical stance, looking for hope in the emerging nations of the Third World, turning his gaze from the frozen streets of Moscow to the burning sands of Algeria and the jungles of Cuba, searching for a new revolution that hadn't yet been corrupted. He was 50 years old, famous, controversial, and increasingly isolated, a philosophical king without a kingdom, realizing that the party was a god that failed, but his hunger for justice was undiminished, leading him to become the champion of the anti-colonial struggles that would define the next chapter of his life, a chapter where he would put his actual physical safety on the line and become a target for assassins, proving that whatever his faults, cowardice was not one of them. The breakup with Camus had left a hole in his heart, but it also freed him to become the purely political animal he thought he needed to be, setting the stage for his involvement in the Algerian War, a conflict that would bring civil war to the streets of France and bring a bomb to Sartre's own doorstep. The brutal crushing of the Hungarian uprising by Soviet tanks in 1956 was the cold bucket of water that finally woke Sartre from his dogmatic slumber, forcing him to publicly condemn the Soviet Union and breaking his ties with the French Communist Party. But unlike his friend Camus, who retreated into a kind of moral pacificism, Sartre didn't move to the centre. He moved further to the radical fringe, turning his gaze away from the frozen, corrupted politics of Europe towards the burning, vibrant struggles of the Third World, convinced that the real revolution was no longer happening in the factories of Paris or Moscow, but in the rice paddies of Asia, the jungles of Latin America, and most urgently, in the deserts of Algeria. France was tearing itself apart over the Algerian War of Independence, a bloody, savage conflict where the French army was using torture and napalm to hold on to its colony, and while most French intellectuals were terrified to speak out for fear of being branded traitors, Sartre dove headfirst into the fire, becoming the most vocal and hated critic of French colonialism in the world. He didn't just support peace, he supported the FLN, the Algerian liberation fighters who were killing French soldiers and civilians, arguing that the violence of the rebel was a necessary purifying counter-violence against the centuries of structural violence inflicted by the colonizers, a stance that made him a monster in the eyes of half of France and a hero to the other half. This radicalization reached its peak when he met Frantz Fanon, a brilliant psychiatrist and revolutionary from Martinique who was fighting for Algeria, and the two men connected on a deep, visceral level, leading Sartre to write the famous incendiary preface to Fanon's book The Wretched of the Earth, where he wrote sentences that still shock readers today, famously claiming that killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, leaving one man dead and the other man free, a terrifying endorsement of murder that he saw as a grim necessity of history. This wasn't just philosophy anymore, this was war, and Sartre was putting a target on his own back, becoming the #1 enemy of the OAS, a secret terrorist organisation of French military hardliners who wanted to keep Algeria French and who were assassinating anyone who stood in their way. Crowds of right-wing protesters would march through the streets of Paris chanting "Fusillez Sartre," which means "shoot Sartre," and for a while it seemed like someone actually might, as he received death threats daily, and his friends had to organise a security detail to protect him. The danger became very real when the OAS actually bombed his apartment at 42 Rue Bonaparte twice, blowing the front door off its hinges and destroying part of his home. But in a display of incredible cool, Sartre refused to be intimidated, refusing to go into hiding and continuing to walk the streets of Paris, famously saying that he wouldn't let fascists dictate where he lived. While he was dodging bombs and supporting revolutionaries, he was also engaged in a superhuman intellectual struggle to write his second major philosophical work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, a massive, dense attempt to combine the individual freedom of existentialism with the historical determinism of Marxism, trying to answer the question of how free individuals can come together to make history without losing their freedom. To fuel this impossible task, he turned his body into a chemical laboratory, consuming ungodly amounts of coridrain, a mixture of aspirin and amphetamines that was legal at the time, popping pills all day to keep his brain racing, chewing them by the handful until he was writing at a feverish pace of 60 pages a day, his hand barely able to keep up with his thoughts. He was destroying his health, his teeth were rotting, his weight was fluctuating, and he was hallucinating again. But he didn't care because he felt he was in a race against time to solve the riddle of history before he died. The Critique is a monster of a book, brilliant but chaotic, written by a man who was literally speeding, full of long, winding sentences that go on for pages, reflecting the manic energy of a philosopher who was trying to think the entire world into existence at once. At the height of the war, when the Janson network of French citizens who smuggled money in suitcases for the Algerian rebels was put on trial, Sartre wrote a letter to the court declaring that he agreed with the accused and that he too would have carried suitcases for the FLN if asked. A statement that was technically treason and punishable by prison. The government was furious, and ministers demanded that Sartre be arrested. But President Charles de Gaulle, in a moment of legendary French grandeur, stepped in and forbade it, saying, "You do not imprison Voltaire," effectively acknowledging that Sartre was a national treasure who was above the law, a status that only irritated Sartre more because he wanted to be treated like a normal citizen, not a protected monument. The war finally ended with Algerian independence in 1962, a victory that vindicated Sartre's stance but left him exhausted and looking for new battles, having proven that the intellectual could be a powerful political weapon. He had survived the bombs, the drugs, and the hatred of his countrymen to emerge as the godfather of the global New Left, the philosopher king of the revolution who was now ready to take his message of radical freedom to the world stage. He was about to embark on a rockstar tour of the revolutionary capitals of the world, from Havana to Beijing, where he would meet the icons of the era like Che Guevara and Mao, transforming from a French writer into a global symbol of resistance. But as he stepped onto the world stage, the Nobel Prize committee in Sweden was quietly watching, preparing to offer him the ultimate establishment trap that he would famously have to spring. With the nightmare of the Algerian War finally over in 1962, Sartre felt that Europe was old, tired, and corrupted by its colonial sins, so he turned his wandering eye toward the vibrant, explosive energy of the Americas, specifically to the tropical island of Cuba, where a young, bearded lawyer named Fidel Castro had just overthrown a dictator, creating a romantic, chaotic revolution that mesmerized the French philosopher. Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir arrived in Havana in 1960 during the honeymoon phase of the Cuban Revolution, a time of rum, cigars, and endless speeches, and they were treated like visiting royalty by the new regime, driven around the island in jeeps by Castro himself, who would talk for hours about sugarcane and irrigation, while Sartre listened, entranced, believing he was witnessing a new form of direct democracy, where the leader and the people were one. It was here, in the heat of the Caribbean night, that Sartre met the man who would become the ultimate icon of rebellion, Che Guevara, a meeting of two minds that became legendary, with the chain-smoking French intellectual sitting across from the cigar-smoking Argentine guerrilla in a room filled with smoke and revolutionary fervour, leading Sartre to later famously declare that Che was not only an intellectual, but also the most complete human being of our age, a quote that cemented Che's status as a secular saint of the left. Sartre was intoxicated by the lack of protocol in Cuba, the feeling that anything was possible, and he wrote a series of glowing articles titled Hurricane Over Sugar, ignoring the early signs of authoritarianism because he so desperately wanted to believe that a true socialist utopia was being born, a blind spot that was typical of his desire to see his philosophy in action. But while he was chasing revolutions in the tropics, the establishment back in Europe was plotting to kill him with kindness, preparing a trap that would test his integrity more than any prison cell ever could: the Nobel Prize in Literature. By 1964, rumours began to swirl in the literary cafes of Stockholm and Paris that the Swedish Academy had finally decided to honour the bad boy of philosophy, recognising that despite his controversial politics, his impact on literature and thought was undeniable. But when Sartre heard these whispers, he panicked, not because he didn't think he deserved it, but because he knew that accepting it would destroy everything he stood for. He frantically wrote a letter to the Swedish Academy, pleading with them, "Please do not give me this prize," explaining that he always refused official honours, including the Legion of Honour in France, because a writer must remain independent and not be turned into an institution, but in a comedy of errors the letter was either lost, ignored, or arrived too late, and the unstoppable machine of the Nobel Committee rolled on. On October 22nd, 1964, the announcement shook the world. Jean-Paul Sartre was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work, which, rich in ideas and filled with the spirit of freedom and the quest for truth, has exerted a far-reaching influence on our age. A citation that was ironic because the spirit of freedom was exactly why he was about to reject them. Sartre was having lunch at a simple restaurant near the Montparnasse train station when a journalist rushed in and told him the news, and his reaction was one of annoyance rather than joy, leading him to immediately draft a public statement that would become one of the most famous documents in literary history, a manifesto of refusal where he explained that a writer who adopts political, social, or literary positions must act only with the means that are his own, that is, the written word, and that accepting a prize like the Nobel would add Nobel Prize winner to his name, effectively transforming him from a free individual into a statue, a brand, and a representative of Western culture, which he refused to be. He argued that the Nobel Prize was a political tool used by the West to reward writers who fit their agenda, noting that they had ignored the great communist writers and only picked him now that he was becoming less dangerous, calling the prize a kiss of death that would neutralise his biting critique of society. The refusal created a global media firestorm, with headlines screaming "Sartre spurns the Nobel," and while his admirers saw it as the ultimate act of integrity, a man walking the walk of his own philosophy, his critics called it a stunt of massive arrogance, pointing out that he was turning down a fortune in prize money, about $53,000 at the time, which was a huge sum, that could have been used to help the causes he supported. The scandal was delicious to the press, and they hounded him mercilessly, camping outside his apartment and chasing him down the street, forcing him to flee into hiding at Simone de Beauvoir's sister's house to escape the madness, proving his point that the prize was a circus that had nothing to do with literature. But the most hilarious part of the story, a detail often left out, is that years later, rumours surfaced that Sartre's lawyer actually contacted the Nobel Committee to ask if he could quietly receive the money without the prize, a request the Swedes politely but firmly refused, stating that the money was part of the award, and since he rejected the award, the money went back into the fund, a final irony that showed even the philosopher of anti-materialism wasn't immune to the reality of cash. Despite the refusal, the Nobel incident made him even more famous, transforming him into a living myth, the man who was too big for the Nobel Prize, the untouchable conscience of the world who answered to no one but himself. He had successfully defended his freedom, but he was now approaching his 60th birthday, and the world was changing fast. The generation of the 1960s was rising, a generation of students who had read his books and were about to take his ideas of rebellion and apply them to the streets of Paris in a way that would shock even him. The stage was being set for the chaotic explosion of May 1968, the moment when the theory of revolution would crash into the reality of burning cars and tear gas, and Sartre, the old master, would find himself running to catch up with the very youth he had inspired, trying to stay relevant in a world that was moving faster than his pen could write. This refusal was the peak of his celebrity, the moment he became a global icon of defiance. But it was also the beginning of his physical decline, as the years of amphetamines, cigarettes, and stress began to take their toll on his body, leading him toward a twilight where he would have to fight his final battles not against the bourgeoisie, but against his own fading eyesight and the encroaching darkness. By the mid-1960s, Sartre was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the global intelligentsia, a man whose refusal of the Nobel Prize had only increased his mythical status. But he wasn't content to sit on his laurels and act like a retired wise man, instead throwing himself into the burning controversy of the Vietnam War with the ferocity of a teenager. In 1966, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell asked him to preside over an international war crimes tribunal to judge the American intervention in Vietnam, a mock trial that had no legal power but immense moral weight, and Sartre accepted, spending months analysing reports of napalm and bombing, eventually delivering a blistering verdict that accused the United States of genocide, arguing that the American machine was systematically destroying the Vietnamese people and their land, a conclusion that made him persona non grata in the US but a hero to the anti-war movement globally. He was effectively putting America on trial in the court of public opinion, using his fame to shine a light on atrocities that the mainstream press was often ignoring, proving once again that the intellectual could be a counterpower to the state. But the real earthquake was about to hit closer to home, in the streets of Paris, where the bored and stifled generation of the baby boom was about to explode in the legendary events of May 1968, a massive student uprising that would bring the French government to its knees and seemingly fulfill Sartre's lifelong dream of a spontaneous revolution. When the barricades went up in the Latin Quarter and students started throwing cobblestones at the police, shouting slogans like, "It is forbidden to forbid," and "Under the paving stones, the beach," Sartre was ecstatic, seeing it as the moment of freedom he had been writing about for 30 years, a fusing of the group into a single revolutionary force. While the Communist Party condemned the students as spoiled brats and chaotic anarchists, Sartre rushed to the radio to support them, declaring that violence is the only thing that remains to the students who have nothing, a statement that shocked the establishment but endeared him to the youth. He was the only old-school intellectual the students respected, and in a surreal scene, the 62-year-old philosopher walked into the occupied Sorbonne University, which had become a red base, to speak to the students in a packed lecture hall, looking like a grandfather visiting a rock concert. Yet when he tried to speak, he was met with a mix of cheers and jeers, with one student famously passing him a note that said, "Sartre, be brief," a harsh reminder that while he was their inspiration, he was also part of the old world they wanted to destroy. He realised then that he was no longer the vanguard. He was the fellow traveller of a new generation that moved faster than him. But instead of being bitter, he humbled himself, famously interviewing the student leader Daniel Cohn-Bendit, not as a master questioning a pupil, but as an observer asking the youth for guidance, symbolically handing over the torch of revolution. When the fires of May 68 eventually burned out and order was restored by President de Gaulle, most intellectuals went back to their books, but Sartre went the other direction, radicalising even further, deciding that the Communist Party was dead and that the future lay with the Maoists, the extreme left-wing radicals who believed in permanent revolution. He joined forces with the Gauche Prolétarienne, proletarian left, a group of young militants who were banned by the government, and in a supreme act of defiance, he agreed to become the nominal editor of their illegal newspaper, La Cause du Peuple, the cause of the people, solely to protect it from the police. The logic was brilliant. The previous editors had been thrown in jail, but Sartre knew the government wouldn't dare arrest a Nobel laureate, so he used his fame as a shield, standing on the street corners of Paris selling the banned newspaper, shouting, "Aide la cause du peuple," while the police stood by helplessly, paralysed by the order, "You don't arrest Voltaire." It was a bizarre spectacle, the most famous writer in the world acting like a paperboy for a fringe radical group, but for Sartre, it was the ultimate act of commitment, putting his body on the line to defend freedom of speech, even if he didn't agree with every word the Maoists wrote. He was pushing his philosophy to the absolute limit, trying to shed his skin as a classic intellectual to become a new intellectual who didn't just write about the masses but merged with them, visiting factories, talking to workers at the gates of Renault plants, standing on top of barrels to give speeches, looking tiny and frail but radiating an intense manic energy. This period was the passionate autumn of his life, a time of extreme militancy where he alienated many of his old friends who thought he'd gone crazy or was being manipulated by the young Maoists. But Sartre didn't care about respectability. He cared about action. He even broke with Fidel Castro in 1971 after the Cuban regime arrested a poet, proving that his loyalty to freedom was higher than his loyalty to any specific revolution, a consistency that earned him grudging respect even from his enemies. But while his spirit was willing, the flesh was weak. The years of chain-smoking 2 packs of Boyards, strong, unfiltered cigarettes, a day, the alcohol, the amphetamines and the stress were finally catching up with him, and in the early 1970s he suffered a series of minor strokes that were the warning shots of the end. He began to lose the one tool that mattered more to him than anything else, his eyesight, a cruel irony for a man who lived to read and write, forcing him to confront a darkness that was closing in not just metaphorically, but literally. The king of the cafe was beginning to stumble, his famous wandering eye now failing him completely, yet he refused to stop dictating his thoughts, engaging in hunger strikes for political prisoners, and preparing for his final controversial masterpiece, a massive biography of Gustave Flaubert that would be the tombstone of his intellect. The world was moving into the disco era, the radical energy of the 60s was fading into the cynicism of the 70s, but Sartre remained, a fragile, half-blind giant in a leather jacket, still fighting the battles of yesterday with the weapons of tomorrow, unaware that his final and most painful struggle would not be political, but a battle for his own legacy against the people closest to him. The twilight of the god was approaching, and it would be a slow, painful fade into the silence he had spent his entire life trying to fill with words, marking the beginning of the long goodbye of Jean-Paul Sartre. In the early 1970s, while the world was moving on to disco and détente, Jean-Paul Sartre retreated into a private obsession that would consume the last lucid years of his life, a monumental literary project that was less of a biography and more of a paper skyscraper, a 3,000-page analysis of the 19th century writer Gustave Flaubert titled The Family Idiot. It might seem bizarre that the philosopher of revolution would spend a decade dissecting the life of a bourgeois writer he famously claimed to hate, but for Sartre, Flaubert was the ultimate test case for his philosophy, a laboratory where he wanted to prove that if you have enough data, letters, diaries, historical context, you can explain a human being completely down to their smallest thought. He called it the family idiot because Flaubert was slow to learn to read as a child and was considered the idiot of his brilliant family, a theme that resonated deeply with Sartre's own childhood feelings of being an impostor, and he poured his remaining life force into this book, writing with a maniacal intensity that terrified his friends, analysing Flaubert's relationship with his mother, his passive nature, and his vomiting spells with the precision of a detective. He churned out 2 massive volumes in 1971 and a third in 1972, a total of nearly 3,000 pages of dense, microscopic analysis that is widely considered a masterpiece of psychoanalytic biography, but is also practically unreadable for the average person, a sprawling labyrinth of words that stands as a testament to his belief that every man is the whole world. But the tragedy of this magnum opus is that he never finished it, not because he ran out of ideas, but because his body finally staged a rebellion against the abuse he had heaped upon it for decades, specifically his eyes, which had been weak since childhood and were now succumbing to the ravages of hypertension and years of strain. In 1973, while pushing to finish the 4th volume, he suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage in his left eye, his good eye, leaving him virtually blind, able only to distinguish light from shadow and shapes from movement, a cruel sentence for a man whose entire existence was defined by reading and writing. The pen dropped from his hand, and for the first time in his life the flow of ink stopped, leaving the idiot unfinished and Sartre stranded in a world of blurring shadows, a crisis he described with heartbreaking honesty. "My occupation as a writer is completely destroyed. I have no reason to be alive." He had to rely on Simone de Beauvoir and his friends to read to him, to tell him what was in the newspapers, and to guide him down the street, a dependency that humiliated his fiercely independent spirit, but also brought out a new, softer side of the old warrior, who began to rely on the spoken word, conducting interviews and engaging in recorded dialogues to keep his mind sharp. Yet, even as a blind man, he refused to retire from the political stage, and in 1974 he embarked on one of his most controversial missions yet, a trip to West Germany to visit the leaders of the Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang, in the high-security Stammheim prison. Andreas Baader and his group were far-left urban guerrillas who had engaged in bombings and bank robberies, and they were holding a hunger strike to protest their isolation, claiming they were being tortured by sensory deprivation. So Sartre, the champion of the oppressed, agreed to visit them to draw attention to their conditions, sparking a diplomatic nightmare between France and Germany. The media circus was intense, with cameras capturing the frail, shuffling philosopher arriving at the prison in Stuttgart, looking like a ghost of his former self, shivering in a heavy coat, to meet the young, arrogant terrorist who represented the violent extreme of the ideas Sartre had once flirted with. The meeting was a disaster. Baader was rude and dismissive, treating the Nobel refuser like a senile old fool, while Sartre, though publicly defending their rights as prisoners, privately called Baader an arsehole and realised that this violent nihilistic terrorism had nothing to do with the freedom he preached. It was a sad spectacle, the grandfather of the revolution trying to connect with its bastard children and realising they didn't speak the same language. But it proved that Sartre was still willing to put his reputation on the line for what he believed was a matter of human rights, even if the public saw it as sympathising with murderers. Back in Paris, his life was shrinking to the circle of his family, a group of women, mostly ex-lovers and adopted daughters, who took care of him, and a young man named Benny Levy, also known as Pierre Victor, a brilliant radical Maoist leader who became his private secretary and intellectual sparring partner. Levy was young, aggressive, and demanding, and he began to push Sartre to rethink his entire philosophy, challenging him to abandon his old Marxist ideas and explore questions of ethics and Jewish messianism, a dialogue that would consume Sartre's final years and lead to a controversial set of interviews that shocked his old friends. Simone de Beauvoir, in particular, hated Levy, viewing him as a manipulator who was taking advantage of a senile old man to rewrite his legacy, leading to a bitter war of the court around the blind philosopher who sat in his armchair smoking cigarettes, listening to the arguments swirling around him, sometimes playing one side against the other. He was no longer writing books, but he was living his philosophy of transparency, talking openly about his failings, his sexuality, and his decline in interviews that were shockingly raw, stripping away the myth of the great intellectual to reveal the fragile human being underneath. He would spend his summers in Rome with Beauvoir, eating ice cream and sitting in the piazza, listening to the sounds of the city he could no longer see, accepting his fate with a stoic dignity that was deeply moving. He famously said, "I don't like being old," but he refused to indulge in self-pity, treating his blindness as just another situation to be navigated, another constraint to be transcended by consciousness. The 1970s were a long, slow fade, a time when the world began to treat him like a historical monument that was still breathing, honouring him but no longer listening to him, yet he remained a potent symbol, signing petitions for Soviet dissidents, supporting the boat people of Vietnam, and proving that while his eyes were dim, his moral vision was as sharp as ever. The family idiot had become the blind seer of Paris, sitting in the dark, waiting for the final act of his existence, while the controversy over his last thoughts, manipulated by Levy or a genuine final evolution, was brewing a storm that would explode right after his death. As the 1970s dragged on, the blind philosopher's apartment on the boulevard Edgar Quinet became the stage for a vicious, quiet war for the soul and legacy of Jean-Paul Sartre, a domestic battle royale that pitted the Valkyries, his longtime female companions, led by the formidable Simone de Beauvoir, against the newcomer Benny Levy, the young, brilliant and aggressive secretary who had become the blind man's eyes, and some feared his brain. This conflict wasn't just about jealousy. It was an ideological deathmatch because Levy, a former Maoist street fighter who had discovered his Jewish roots and the ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, was systematically dismantling Sartre's old Marxist certainties during their long, smoke-filled recording sessions, pushing the old atheist to consider concepts like messianism, the resurrection of the dead, and a new kind of hope that sounded suspiciously religious. To Beauvoir and the family, this was nothing short of elder abuse, a hijacking of a senile genius by a manipulative upstart who was taking advantage of Sartre's vulnerability to rewrite his final chapter, turning the great materialist into a mystic, a betrayal that cut Beauvoir to the bone because she felt she was losing her lifelong partner not to death, but to a philosophy she despised. But Sartre, despite his physical frailty and his shuffling walk, insisted he was perfectly lucid, arguing that he wasn't being brainwashed but was simply evolving, realizing that his previous obsession with conflict and class struggle had failed to explain the need for human brotherhood, and that he wanted to end his life on a note of ethics rather than violence. The result of these intense private debates was a series of interviews titled Hope Now, L'espoir maintenant, which were published in Le Nouvel Observateur in March 1980, just weeks before his death, dropping like a bombshell on the French intellectual scene and causing a scandal that would tarnish his final days. In these interviews, Sartre shocked his followers by renouncing some of his most cherished radical ideas, suggesting that the revolutionary violence he had once championed in Algeria and with the Maoists was perhaps a dead end, and proposing a vague, softer future based on fraternity and hope, words that sounded like betrayal to the hardline leftists who had worshipped him as the priest of revolution. The reaction was brutal. His old friends called him senile, the communists laughed, and Beauvoir was reportedly in tears, feeling that the text was an abject disavowal of everything they had built together. Yet she couldn't stop its publication because Sartre, stubborn to the end, slammed his hand on the table and declared, "I am the one who decides," asserting his autonomy even as his body was failing. This period was a tragedy of miscommunication and fading light, where the man who had defined the 20th century was trying to find a way out of his own system, grasping for a moral framework that could survive the collapse of his political dreams, all while living in a body that was rapidly betraying him. His lifestyle of excess, the whiskey, the amphetamines, the cigarettes, had destroyed his circulation, leading to gangrene-like symptoms in his toes and a mind that drifted in and out of clarity, creating moments where he would hallucinate or lapse into silence, only to snap back with a brilliant, biting remark that proved the lion was still in there. He was effectively a prisoner of his own infirmity, dependent on others to read to him, to feed him, and to guide him to the bathroom, a humiliation for the philosopher of absolute freedom that he bore with a strange, sweet patience, calling his blindness a hiatus rather than an end. He spent his days listening to music, particularly Beethoven and jazz, and talking to Levy, trying to formulate this new ethics that would never be finished, a final, incomplete project that hangs over his legacy like a question mark. Was hope now the rambling of a dying man manipulated by a young zealot, or was it the courageous final act of a thinker who was brave enough to admit he might have been wrong? The debate rages to this day, but what is certain is that in those final months of 1980, Sartre was saying goodbye to the world on his own terms, refusing to be frozen in the statue the world had built for him, fighting to remain a man among men right up to the bitter end. He knew he was dying. He talked about it with a terrifying calmness, discussing his funeral and his legacy as if he were planning a trip, telling Beauvoir that his death would not be a grand metaphysical event, but just a natural fact, a return to the earth that he didn't fear because as an atheist, he expected nothing on the other side. The winter of 1980 was cold and bleak, mirroring the atmosphere in the apartment where the phone rang constantly with reporters wanting to know if the rumours of his illness were true, while inside the circle of women and Levy maintained an uneasy truce, united only by their impending loss. It was the end of an era, the slow extinguishing of the lighthouse that had guided French thought for 40 years, and as March turned to April, the physical reality of his condition became impossible to ignore, leading to the final crisis that would rush him to the Broussais hospital, not as a philosopher, but as a dying patient named Jean-Paul Sartre. The Hope Now scandal was the final flare-up of his public life, a last controversy for the road, proving that even on his deathbed he had the power to divide, confuse and fascinate the world, leaving us with a final image not of a triumphant hero, but of a frail, blind old man trying to whisper one last truth before the silence took him forever. The final curtain began to fall on the morning of April 15, 1980, in the sterile, white-walled room of the Broussais Hospital in Paris, where Jean-Paul Sartre lay dying not as a famous philosopher, but as a small, exhausted man whose body had simply given up after 74 years of relentless activity. He had been rushed there a few days earlier with fluid in his lungs, gasping for breath, his kidneys failing, the toxic byproduct of a lifetime of cigarettes and neglect finally cashing in its bill, and as he lay there, drifting in and out of a coma, the world outside held its breath, sensing that the era of the great intellectual was ending. Simone de Beauvoir, his caster, was by his side, watching the man who had been the other half of her brain for 50 years slowly fade away, a heartbreaking vigil where she recorded his final moments with the same unflinching honesty they had applied to their entire lives. In a moment of lucid clarity before the end, he turned his blind eyes toward her and whispered his last words, "I love you very much, my little caster," a simple, tender declaration that closed the circle of their legendary partnership, stripping away all the philosophy and the politics to leave just the love between two people. At 9:01 p.m. on that Tuesday night, Jean-Paul Sartre died, and the news hit Paris like a physical blow, spreading through the cafes of the left bank, the newsrooms and the student dorms, carrying the heavy realization that the conscience of the world was gone. The next morning, the newspaper Libération, which he had helped found, published a special edition with a headline that consisted of just 3 words across the entire front page: "Il est mort," he is dead. No name needed because everyone knew who he was. There was only one Sartre. But if his death was quiet, his funeral on Saturday, April 19th, was a chaotic, deafening explosion of public grief that turned into one of the wildest spectacles in the history of Paris, a scene that looked less like a funeral and more like a riot or a rock concert. Sartre had requested no official honours, no priest, and no politicians, wanting just a simple burial. But he had forgotten one variable: the people. Over 50,000 people, some estimates say closer to 100,000, flooded the streets of Montparnasse to say goodbye, a massive, crushing tidal wave of humanity that defied all police control, clogging the boulevards and bringing the city to a standstill. It was a crowd made up of everyone. Famous writers and movie stars walked alongside factory workers in blue overalls, students in leather jackets, African immigrants, housewives, and old resistance fighters, a chaotic mix of society that proved his philosophy had touched every corner of life. The hearse, carrying his plain oak coffin, could barely move through the sea of bodies, and people were climbing onto the roofs of cars, hanging from lampposts and scaling the trees just to get a glimpse of the procession, creating a surreal, carnival-like atmosphere that was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. At the Montparnasse cemetery, the scene turned into a near disaster, as the mob broke through the police barriers, desperate to get close to the grave, pushing and shoving with such intensity that for a terrifying moment it looked like the coffin itself might be knocked over, or that people would fall into the open pit. One of the mourners actually fell into the grave on top of the coffin in the melee, a moment of supreme absurdity that Sartre, with his love for the grotesque and the unexpected, might have grimly appreciated as the ultimate existential situation. Simone de Beauvoir, sedated and supported by friends, was almost crushed by the crowd, a tiny figure lost in the storm of adoration for the man she loved, forcing the burial to be completed in a rush just to restore order. It was the last great demonstration of the French left, a final spontaneous uprising of the Sartre generation, who came not to bury a saint, but to mourn the man who had told them they were free, creating a spectacle that was messy, loud, uncontrolled, and absolutely authentic, exactly the kind of situation Sartre would have analysed for pages. As the dirt hit the coffin, it signalled the end of a specific time in history, the end of the era where a writer could be a superhero, where a book could change the government, and where philosophy was something you lived on the streets, not just studied in a classroom. He was buried near his mother and stepfather, finally at rest in the bourgeois earth he had spent his life criticising. But the irony of the massive crowd proved that despite his refusal of the Nobel Prize and his hatred of institutions, he had become the biggest institution of all, a legend. The aftermath of the funeral left a strange silence in Paris, a vacuum that no one else could fill, because while there were other smart people, other writers, and other activists, there was no one else who combined all three with such reckless, terrifying intensity. But the story doesn't end in the grave, because the death of Sartre triggered a massive reassessment of his life, unleashing a flood of memoirs, attacks, and revelations that would drag his reputation through the mud, questioning his politics, his treatment of women, and his final interviews, turning the dead philosopher into a battlefield once again. The 1980s would not be kind to his memory, as the intellectual tide turned against Marxism and the masters of thought, leading to a period of Sartre bashing, where it became fashionable to mock his errors and ignore his genius, a backlash that was perhaps inevitable for a man who had taken up so much space for so long. Yet, even in death, he remained dangerous, a ghost that refused to be exorcised, because every time someone tried to declare him obsolete, a new generation would discover nausea or existentialism as a humanism and feel that electric shock of recognition, realizing that the old man with the wall eye was speaking directly to them about their own anxiety and their own freedom. The funeral was the grand finale of the public man, the total intellectual, but the private man, the lover of Beauvoir and the writer of the self, was about to be exposed in ways he never planned, starting with the publication of his letters and diaries, which would reveal a shocking, intimate side of Sartre that would complicate his legacy even further, proving that the man who claimed existence precedes essence was far more complex than even he understood. The dust had barely settled on Sartre's grave in Montparnasse when the long knives of the French intellectual establishment came out, ushering in a brutal decade of Sartre bashing during the 1980s, where the man who had been the god of philosophy was suddenly dragged down and treated like a false idol, a confused apologist for tyrants whose political errors were no longer forgiven. The timing was perfect for his enemies, because the 1980s was the era of the anti-totalitarian turn in France, led by thinkers who were horrified by the Soviet Union and viewed Sartre's long support of the East not as a noble mistake, but as a criminal blindness, leading to a revisionist history where he was painted as a dangerous fool who had misled an entire generation of youth into radicalism. It became fashionable to say Sartre was wrong and Camus was right, elevating his former best friend to the status of a prophet, while dismissing Sartre as a dinosaur of the Cold War, a reversal of fortune that would have stung the competitive philosopher deeply. But while the political sharks were tearing apart his public legacy, Simone de Beauvoir was quietly preparing a literary bombshell that would humanize him in a shocking, controversial way. the publication of Adieu, a Farewell to Sartre in 1981, a book that chronicled the last 10 years of his life with a raw, brutal honesty that scandalised his friends and admirers. In this book, Beauvoir didn't paint him as a hero. She described in graphic detail his incontinence, his confusion, his drooling, and his heavy drinking, stripping away all the dignity of the great man to show the rotting body underneath. A move that many critics called an act of revenge or a lack of respect, accusing her of settling scores with the man who had overshadowed her for so long. However, Beauvoir argued she was simply staying true to their pact of total transparency, refusing to lie about the reality of death even when it was ugly, forcing the public to look at the decay of their idol, whether they wanted to or not. But the real surprise came with the posthumous publication of his war diaries and his letters, specifically the letters to Castor, which revealed a side of Sartre that no one expected. The gossipy, emotional, and often manipulative lover who was obsessed not with the dialectic of history, but with his own complex love life. These letters showed him juggling multiple women, lying to them, managing their jealousies, and reporting every sordid detail back to Beauvoir, creating a picture of a man who was less of a moral saint and more of a seducer who used women as mirrors for his own ego. This revelation complicated his status as a feminist ally, which he had claimed to be later in life, because while he supported women's rights politically, his private behaviour was often that of a traditional patriarch who enjoyed having a harem of dependent women, a contradiction that feminist scholars began to dissect with ruthless precision. Yet, paradoxically, these personal writings also saved his literary reputation because they were so brilliantly written, so full of life and wit and vulnerability, that even his harshest critics had to admit that, political errors aside, the man could write like an angel. The war diaries in particular, written during the phony war before his political radicalisation, showed a fresh, curious, and incredibly observant mind that was far more appealing than the dogmatic Marxist of the 1950s, leading to a literary rediscovery of Sartre, where people began to separate the artist from the activist. While the political world was busy tearing down his statues, a new generation of readers was falling in love with the young Sartre, the one who loved jazz and cinema and freedom, proving that his voice was still alive and kicking beneath the rubble of his political mistakes. This period of the 1980s was a necessary purgatory for his reputation, a burning away of the cult of personality to see what, if anything, would survive the fire, and what survived was the sheer, undeniable power of his existential analysis, specifically his early work, which began to look more and more like a classic description of the human condition rather than just a trendy philosophy. But the drama wasn't over, because in 1985 the other pillar of the temple fell. Simone de Beauvoir died, leaving the estate and the legacy in the hands of a new controversial figure, her adopted daughter Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir, who would clash with Sartre's adopted daughter, Alette El-Kaïm Sartre, sparking a war of the daughters over the archives and the copyrights that would turn the management of Sartre's posthumous works into a legal and editorial soap opera. This family feud meant that publishing the rest of his manuscripts became a slow, painful process, with each camp guarding their secrets, leaving scholars frustrated and fueling even more rumours about what was still hidden in the vaults. The 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall seemed to be the final nail in the coffin of Sartre's Marxism, as the Soviet bloc he had once defended collapsed in a cloud of dust, making his political writings look like relics of a dead civilization. Yet, strangely, as the 90s began, the end of history didn't bring the end of Sartre. Instead, the rise of new global crises, ethnic conflicts, and the question of individual responsibility in a chaotic world made his central question, "What can I do?" relevant all over again. The pendulum was preparing to swing back, but first the world had to grapple with the full extent of his sins, particularly the accusations of collaboration during the occupation which surfaced periodically, and the uncomfortable details of his sexual trio relationships, which were becoming public knowledge, painting a portrait of a man who was deeply flawed, often selfish, but endlessly fascinating in his refusal to be boring. The monument was gone, replaced by a complex, messy human being, and for a modern audience that messiness was far more interesting than the perfection of a saint, setting the stage for a 21st century revival where Sartre would be read not for his answers, but for the relentless, terrifying honesty of his questions. As the world marched into the 1990s, leaving the Cold War in the dustbin of history, Jean-Paul Sartre seemed destined to stay there with it, viewed by the cool, ironic Generation X as a dusty relic of a bygone era of ideological fervour, a dead dog of philosophy whose obsession with commitment felt embarrassing in the age of Nirvana and the internet. However, just when it seemed safe to bury him forever, a new scandal erupted in 1993 that dragged his personal life back into the spotlight, not as a political error, but as a moral crime, shattering the romantic myth of his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir. The catalyst was a memoir titled Memoirs of a Disturbed Young Lady by Bianca Lamblin, who had been one of the trio members in the 1930s, a student of Beauvoir who was seduced by both of them and then ruthlessly discarded. Her book painted a horrifying picture of Sartre and Beauvoir not as the liberated, cool couple of the century, but as emotional predators who used their intellect and charm to prey on vulnerable young students, collecting them like butterflies and crushing them when they got bored, revealing that their famous open relationship was often built on the suffering of the third person. This revelation hit the French public like a slap in the face because it turned the gods of the left into abusive monsters, sparking a fierce debate about the separation of the artist and the man that feels incredibly relevant today in the era of named Me Too. Critics asked, can we still admire the philosopher of freedom if he treated women like disposable objects? The answer for many was a complicated yes, but forcing a rereading of his work through a darker lens, seeing his theories on the gaze and possession not just as abstract concepts, but as descriptions of his own predatory behaviour. Yet, despite these personal stains, the philosophical wheel began to turn again as the new millennium approached, specifically with the massive centennial celebration of his birth in 2005, which turned into a national event in France known as the Sartre Year. To everyone's surprise, the exhibitions at the Bibliothèque Nationale were packed, not just with old professors, but with young people who were discovering that in a world dominated by consumerism, genetic determinism, and the feeling that we are just data points in an algorithm, Sartre's radical insistence that we are free was suddenly a breath of fresh air. The Sartre Year marked his official rehabilitation, where the French establishment finally forgave him for his political sins and embraced him as a classic writer, placing him in the pantheon alongside Voltaire and Hugo, effectively neutralising his danger by turning him into a national monument. It was a massive irony that the man who hated institutions was now the star of the biggest institutional celebration in Paris, with President Jacques Chirac, a right-wing politician, visiting the exhibition to pay homage to the leftist radical, proving that Sartre had become bigger than politics. He was now simply France. During this renaissance, scholars began diving into the thousands of pages of his unfinished works that were being slowly released by his daughter Arlette, discovering that the political Sartre was only half the story, and that he had spent decades secretly working on a massive ethics that he never finished. These posthumous books, like Notebooks for an Ethics, revealed a thinker who was desperately trying to find a way to be good in a bad world, struggling with the concepts of generosity, gift-giving, and the other, in a way that was far more nuanced than his public statement suggested. We began to see a moral Sartre emerging from the shadow of the political Sartre, a man who knew that violence was a trap and was searching for a way out, which made him far more sympathetic to a modern audience tired of dogmatism. Furthermore, the rise of the internet and social media gave his concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, a terrifying new relevance. Because what is a Facebook profile or an Instagram filter if not a massive exercise in bad faith? Sartre's description of the waiter who plays at being a waiter perfectly predicted the curated lives of the digital age, where we're constantly performing a version of ourselves for the gaze of the other, terrified of being seen as we truly are. Suddenly, reading Sartre in 2010 didn't feel like reading a history book. It felt like reading a diagnosis of the modern condition, where the pressure to be yourself conflicts with the pressure to conform, creating a deep existential anxiety that pills and apps can't fix. He became the philosopher of the selfie age, the man who understood that hell is other people, long before the comment section on YouTube existed, because he understood that we are constantly being judged, categorized, and fixed by the eyes of others, and that the struggle of life is to maintain our freedom against that crushing weight. Even his atheism took on a new power in the 21st century, as religious fundamentalism returned to the global stage, making his stark, brave declaration that we are alone, without excuses, a rallying cry for secular humanists who wanted to find meaning without dogma. The War of the Daughters continued to simmer in the background, with Arlette Elkaim Sartre guarding the estate with an iron fist until her own death, often blocking publication of certain letters or acting as a strict gatekeeper, which frustrated biographers but also added to the mystery, suggesting that there were still secrets in the vault waiting to be discovered. As we moved further away from the 20th century, the specific details of his fights with the communists or his support for Mao began to fade into the background, becoming footnotes, while the core of his message, the terrifying, exhilarating reality of individual freedom, remained indestructible. He was no longer the total intellectual who had an opinion on everything from the price of milk to the war in Vietnam, because that role had become impossible in a fractured, complex world, but he remained the total writer, a man who had used every genre, novels, plays, essays, biographies, to explore the human condition. The 20th century was often called Sartre's century by his contemporaries, and as we look back from the vantage point of the 21st, it becomes clear that he was the intellectual anchor of that era, the man who absorbed all the shocks of history, the wars, the genocides, the revolutions, and tried to make sense of them through the sheer force of his intellect. He was the filter through which Europe processed its trauma, and even if his answers were often wrong, his willingness to ask the questions and to take responsibility for his time was a model of courage that is sorely missing in today's landscape of careful, PR-managed public figures. We realise that we missed him, not because we agreed with him, but because he was a giant in a world of dwarves, a man who dared to think that a single human consciousness could hold the weight of the entire world. But the story of Sartre isn't just about his rehabilitation. It's about the enduring mystery of his philosophy itself, which still has one final massive card to play: the concept of the look and how it defines our relationships, a concept that we're going to explore in the next part as we see how Sartre's ideas have infiltrated pop culture, film, and the very way we understand love and hate today. The dead dog was very much alive, barking loudly from the grave, and as we approach the conclusion of our journey, we have to ask, what does Sartre have to teach us right now, today, in a world that seems to be losing its mind? The answer might be found in his most famous and misunderstood phrase, "Existence precedes essence," a three-word revolution that is the key to unlocking your own life, if you have the courage to use it. You might think that Jean-Paul Sartre is just a name on a dusty book cover, but the truth is that his DNA is woven into the very fabric of modern pop culture, influencing everything from The Matrix to Breaking Bad, because he was the first one to truly articulate the terrifying, exhilarating narrative of the anti-hero who constructs his own identity in a godless world. When Walter White says, "I am the one who knocks," he's having a purely Sartrean moment, rejecting his essence as a weak high school teacher and choosing, through radical action, to become a drug lord, proving Sartre's most famous maxim, "Existence precedes essence." This three-word phrase is the master key to his entire philosophy, and it sounds simple, but it is actually one of the most terrifying concepts ever invented, because it means that there is no blueprint for your life, no destiny, no fate, and no God to tell you who you are. You simply exist first, you show up on the scene, and then you define yourself by what you do. for the American audience raised on the idea of finding yourself, as if your true self is a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered. Sartre says, no, you don't find yourself, you create yourself, which implies that if your life is a mess, it is entirely your fault, a level of personal responsibility that is so heavy it creates what he called anguish. This anguish is not just fear, it is the vertigo you feel when you stand on a cliff and realize that nothing is stopping you from jumping except your own will. The realization that anything is possible is actually a nightmare because it means you have to choose constantly. To escape this crushing weight of freedom, we engage in what Sartre called bad faith, mauvaise foi, which is basically lying to ourselves to convince ourselves that we have no choice, like the famous example he gives of the waiter in a cafe who is moving a little too quickly, acting a little too eager, playing at being a waiter because he wants to believe that waiter is his destiny, so he doesn't have to face the fact that he could walk out the door and be an artist or a revolutionary. In the 21st century, we are drowning in bad faith. From the corporate employee who says, I'm just following protocol, to the internet troll who says, I'm just doing it for the lulz. All of us trying to hide behind roles and masks to avoid the terrifying reality that we are free agents. But the most chilling concept he gave us, and the one that explains our modern obsession with social media, is the look, le regard. A psychological mechanism he describes in Being and Nothingness, using the example of a jealous lover looking through a keyhole. When you're looking through the keyhole, you're pure consciousness. You're the master of the scene. You're a subject. But suddenly you hear a floorboard creak behind you, and you realize someone is watching you. In that split second, shame floods your body, and you are instantly transformed from a subject into an object, a thing for the other person to judge. This is the origin of his famous line, "Hell is other people," from the play No Exit. He didn't mean that people are annoying. He meant that other people have the power to freeze you with their gaze, to turn you into a static object, stealing your world and your freedom just by looking at you. If you think about Instagram or TikTok, it is a global machine of the look, where we voluntarily turn ourselves into objects for the gaze of millions, curating our lives to control how we are seen, terrified of the judgment of the other, living in a constant state of performance that Sartre predicted 70 years ago. His influence is all over The Good Place, which is basically a sitcom version of No Exit, and in movies like Fight Club, where the protagonist has to destroy his bourgeois life to find authenticity, reflecting Sartre's hatred of the comfort that puts our freedom to sleep. Even the concept of the gamification of life relates to Sartre, because he viewed life as a project where we are constantly rolling the dice. But unlike a game, there are no rules and you can never restart. He understood that we are condemned to be free, a phrase that captures the paradox that we didn't ask to be born, yet we are responsible for everything we do. A brutal logic that strips away all our excuses. You can't blame your parents, your childhood, or your society, because ultimately you chose how to react to them. This creates a philosophy of optimistic toughness that is incredibly American in its spirit, telling you that no matter how bad your situation is, you always have the freedom to choose your attitude, to say no, or to try to change it. Sartre's atheism wasn't a depressing void. It was a call to action, removing the safety net of heaven so that we would focus entirely on this life, making every moment infinitely precious, because it is the only time we have to make our mark. He was the philosopher of the situation, arguing that freedom isn't about being able to fly or be invisible, but about how you deal with the specific constraints of your reality, whether you're a prisoner in a cell or a CEO in a boardroom. As we look at the fragmented, anxious world of today, Sartre stands like a giant lighthouse, reminding us that the anxiety we feel isn't a sickness to be cured with pills, but a symptom of our freedom, a signal that we are alive and that we need to stop making excuses and start making choices. He challenges us to live authentically, which means accepting the burden of our freedom without lying to ourselves, a challenge that is harder today than ever before, because we have so many digital distractions designed to make us forget we are free. But Sartre's legacy isn't just about individual psychology. It's about how that individual freedom crashes into the freedom of others, creating history, conflict, and love, leading us to the final, messy, and beautiful reality of his own life, where he tried to apply these impossible standards to his own heart. We are now entering the final stretch of our story, where we must assess the total weight of this man's life, stripping away the myths to see what remains of the Sartre century, and asking the ultimate question: did he succeed in being free, or was he just as trapped as the rest of us? The answer lies in the way we remember him, not as a saint, but as a man who refused to be a stone, a lesson that is the ultimate takeaway for anyone trying to navigate the chaos of the modern world. As we weigh the soul of Jean-Paul Sartre in the balance of history, we have to confront the uncomfortable truth that for the last 40 years he has been losing the popularity contest to his old friend and rival Albert Camus, who is widely seen today as the good existentialist, the moral, handsome, anti-totalitarian hero who was right about the Soviet Union, while Sartre is often cast as the bad existentialist, the ugly, complicated radical who supported dictators and got lost in the weeds of Marxism. But this simplified scorecard is unfair and misses the sheer magnitude of Sartre's tragedy. Because while Camus was a moralist who told us how the world should be, Sartre was an ontologist who tried to describe the world as it is, in all its messy, terrifying ambiguity, taking on the burden of trying to think against himself and against his own class, a mental gymnastics that eventually broke him, but produced a body of work that is far more dangerous and challenging than anything Camus wrote. If we look closely at his autobiography The Words, published in 1964 just before he rejected the Nobel Prize, we see the key to understanding his entire life. It is a brutal, hilarious and heartbreaking deconstruction of his own childhood, where he admits that his entire vocation as a writer was a desperate attempt to justify his existence, to play the role of the genius to please his grandfather, revealing that the man who preached authenticity spent his first 50 years in total bad faith, acting out a script written by his family. This book is a masterpiece of self-hatred and self-analysis, a farewell to literature where he famously declared that a novel is not worth a dying child, signalling his shift from the ivory tower to the streets. Yet the irony is that in dismissing literature, he wrote one of the greatest pieces of literature of the 20th century, proving that he was trapped in his own genius, unable to stop being a writer even when he wanted to be a revolutionary. He is the last of the total intellectuals, a species that has gone extinct in our era of specialized experts and Twitter pundits, because Sartre believed it was his duty to have an opinion on everything, from the price of bread to the structure of the universe, acting as a universal conscience who absorbed the shocks of the world and filtered them through his pen, a role that required an ego the size of a planet but also a strange kind of humility to offer himself up as a public sacrifice. In the 21st century, where we are obsessed with staying in our lane, Sartre's recklessness is almost refreshing. He swerved into every lane, crashing often, but refusing to look away from any injustice, whether it was racism in America, torture in Algeria, or the oppression of the Basques, making him the godfather of post-colonial studies long before it was a trendy academic department. Thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said stood on his shoulders, using his concepts of the other and the gaze to explain how the West looks at the rest of the world, meaning that every time you hear a conversation about privilege or systemic oppression today, you're hearing a distant echo of Sartre's voice, even if the speakers don't realize it. He taught us that to be neutral is to be complicit, that not choosing is still a choice, a terrifying lesson for a generation that loves to float in irony and detachment, forcing us to confront the fact that we are responsible for the wars our taxes fund and the sweatshops that make our phones, a level of global responsibility that is exhausting to carry, which is perhaps why we try to dismiss him as old news. But the most fascinating aspect of his legacy is not political, but personal, the Sartre-Beauvoir Pact, which remains the most ambitious, successful, and disastrous experiment in modern love, a relationship that defied all the rules of monogamy and ownership to create a partnership of brains rather than just bodies. While we now know it was messy and often cruel to others, it was also a heroic attempt to reinvent love as a shared project of freedom, rather than a domestic trap, asking the question that we are still struggling with today. Can you love someone without possessing them? And can you be fully honest with a partner without destroying the mystery? They proved that essential love could survive 50 years of contingent loves, sitting side by side in cafes for half a century, writing their separate books but building a shared world, a level of intellectual intimacy that makes our modern power couples look shallow by comparison. Sartre was also a pioneer of what we now call autofiction, or the public performance of the self. He turned his own life into a philosophical laboratory, living out his ideas in real time, making mistakes in public, and evolving before our eyes, which makes him incredibly modern in a way that the more secretive, polished writers of his time are not. He was transparent about his drug use, his sexuality, his changing politics, and his physical decline, refusing to hide the abject parts of being human, which gives his work a raw, vibrating energy that feels like a direct injection of adrenaline. Even his physical appearance, the short stature, the strabismus, the bad teeth, became part of his power, proving that you didn't need to be an Adonis to be a seducer or a leader, that the mind could triumph over the meat, a vital message in our image-obsessed culture. As we approach the end of our journey through his life, we have to recognise that Sartre was the hinge on which the 20th century turned, the man who bridged the gap between the classical philosophy of the 19th century and the chaotic postmodernism of the late 20th, holding the door open for the radicals of 1968 and the feminists of the 1970s before slowly fading into the darkness of his own blindness. He was a monster, in the original Latin sense of the word. Monstrum, a divine omen, something huge and unnatural that demands to be looked at. And like a monster, he was scary, destructive, but utterly awe-inspiring. We are left now with the task of summarising this sprawling, chaotic life into a final verdict, asking what remains of existentialism when the smoke clears, and whether the philosophy of absolute freedom is a gift or a curse for the digital generation that has too many choices and not enough meaning. The final chapters of our story will look at the afterlife of his ideas, how they mutated and survived the death of Marxism, and why, in a world that is increasingly automated and algorithmic, the stubborn, messy, human assertion of "I exist" is the most radical political act left available to us. We are about to close the book on the man who refused to be classified, but before we do, we must take one last look at the Sartre century to understand why, despite all his flaws, he remains the indispensable reference point for anyone who wants to understand what it means to be a free human being in a world that wants to turn us into machines. One of the most radical and liberating aspects of Sartre's legacy, which puts him on a collision course with the entire billion-dollar American self-help and therapy industry, is his ferocious rejection of the unconscious and his lifelong duel with Sigmund Freud, a battle that redefines how we understand our own minds. While Freud taught us that we are puppets controlled by hidden drives, childhood traumas, and repressed desires locked in a dark basement called the unconscious, Sartre looked at this model and called it a lie, a massive act of bad faith designed to let us off the hook for our actions. Sartre argued that the unconscious doesn't exist. He believed that consciousness is always transparent to itself, meaning that deep down, we always know what we're doing and why we're doing it, even if we pretend we don't. When you say, "I couldn't help it, I was angry," Sartre replies, "No, you chose to be angry because anger was the magical tool you used to try to change the world when you couldn't get your way." A terrifying concept called magical thinking, where emotions are not things that happen to us like the weather, but actions we perform to manipulate reality. This means that for Sartre, there is no inner child driving the bus, and there is no true self buried under layers of trauma. There is only the project, the fundamental choice you make about who you want to be, a choice that you are remaking every single second of your life. This is the foundation of existential psychoanalysis, a method he invented to replace Freudian therapy, which doesn't dig for hidden complexes but looks for that original choice of being, arguing that if you are a passive person, it's not because your mother ignored you, but because at some point you decided that passivity was your best strategy for survival. And, here is the kicker, since you chose it, you can unchoose it right now. This is a slap in the face to the modern culture of victimhood and diagnosis, where we love to say, I have anxiety, or I am a depressive, as if these are fixed essences like having blue eyes. Sartre would say, these are situations that we navigate. And while the chemical reality of the brain is real, the meaning we give to it is ours to define. He hates the idea of character as a prison, the notion that that's just how I am, because for him, character is just a habit we've fallen into, a crust that hardens over our freedom, and the goal of life is to break that crust and reinvent ourselves constantly. This philosophy is incredibly tough because it strips away the comfort of saying, it's not my fault, but it is also incredibly optimistic because it means you're not broken, you're not a slave to your past, and you're not defined by your DNA. You're a pure explosion of freedom that can change direction at any moment. Think about his biography of Jean Genet, the thief and prostitute who became a great writer. Sartre called it Saint-Genet and used it to show how a boy who was branded a thief by society decided to own that label and turn it into a form of art, choosing to be the absolute outsider rather than trying to fit in, proving that we can take the terrible cards society deals us and play them in a way that wins the game. This brings us to the concept of the project, which is the idea that every human life has a trajectory, a goal towards which it is striving, even if we aren't fully aware of it, and that understanding a person means understanding what they are trying to become, not just where they came from. In a world of algorithms that try to predict our behaviour based on our past clicks, Sartre is the glitch in the system, the reminder that the human being is the only thing in the universe that is defined by the future, by what is not yet, rather than by the past. He challenges us to stop living in the rearview mirror, obsessed with our trauma and our backstory, and to look at the windshield asking, what am I choosing to be right now? This is why he is the ultimate philosopher for the age of disruption, because he tells us that stability is an illusion, and that the only security is our ability to reinvent ourselves when the world collapses. But this freedom comes with a price, the dizziness of realization that there are no guardrails, which brings us back to anguish. We try to flee this anguish by filling our lives with noise, scrolling through phones, buying things we don't need, and adopting rigid political identities, all to avoid the silence where the question "who am I?" echoes without an answer. Sartre demands that we sit in that silence and face the nothingness, because it is only in that void that we can create something truly new. His rejection of the unconscious is the ultimate empowerment because it treats you like an adult, fully capable of understanding your own mind, not as a damaged child governed by ghosts. As we move to the penultimate part of our story, we need to look at how this radical view of the individual scales up to the level of humanity, because Sartre didn't just want to save your soul, he wanted to save the world, and his final message to us is about the city of ends, a utopia where everyone's freedom respects everyone else's, a dream that might seem impossible in our polarized times, but is actually the only practical solution to our survival. We're going to explore this final political vision and the group infusion, contrasting the solitary hero of his early years with the solidarity of his later years, to see if he ever found a way to bridge the gap between I and we. The finish line is in sight, and the stakes have never been higher. If the early Sartre was the philosopher of the lonely hero standing on a cliff staring into the abyss of his own freedom, the later Sartre was the man trying to figure out how to get everyone else on that cliff without pushing each other off, a shift that marks the most tragic and ambitious phase of his life, where he tried to solve the puzzle of how I can become we without losing myself. In his massive brain-melting book Critique of Dialectical Reason, He moved beyond the famous line, "Hell is other people," to a more nuanced realization that hell is separation, arguing that the reason we are miserable is that we are trapped in seriality, a state of existence he compared to people standing in line for a bus in Paris. In a bus queue, everyone is facing the same direction, but they are indifferent to each other, united only by an external object, the bus, and their separation, treating each other as obstacles or numbers, which is exactly how we live in modern capitalist society, isolated in our cubicles, our cars, and our social media feeds, connected only by the system, but deeply alone. Sartre wanted to know how to break this isolation, and he found the answer in the group infusion, the magical moment of revolution, when the bus queue suddenly turns into a mob storming the Bastille, where the barriers between people melt away, and I becomes a part of a we that is acting as a single organism. In this moment of fusion, fear vanishes, selfishness vanishes, and everyone is totally free because their individual will is perfectly aligned with the group's will, creating a high of absolute solidarity that Sartre spent the rest of his life chasing, believing it was the only way to escape the alienation of modern life. But here is the tragedy that haunts his political legacy. He realized that this high cannot last because the lava eventually cools, the revolution settles down, and the group has to organize itself to survive, creating institutions, rules, and bureaucracy, what he called the practico-inert. This is the zombie stage of history where the structures we built to free us end up enslaving us, like a union that starts to protect workers but becomes a corrupt machine, or a revolution that overthrows a czar only to build a gulag, a cycle of doom that Sartre saw everywhere. To fight this cooling, the group uses terror, forcing people to stay united through fear and oaths, which led Sartre down the dark path of justifying revolutionary violence and dictatorships, arguing that the terror of the revolution was better than the slime of bourgeois indifference. This is why he supported the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and Castro's Cuba long after other intellectuals had abandoned them. He wasn't blind to their crimes, but he saw them as desperate attempts to keep the fusion alive against the crushing weight of the practico-inert, a gamble that history proved was disastrously wrong. He was so terrified of the soft prison of capitalism, the comfortable, numb life of the consumer, that he was willing to excuse the hard prison of communism, believing that at least the communists were trying to build the city of ends, a utopia where every person is treated as an absolute end and never as a means to an end. This city of ends was his version of the kingdom of heaven, a society of total transparency where no one lies, no one hides, and everyone's freedom enhances everyone else's, a beautiful, impossible dream that makes his errors look less like malice and more like the desperation of a man who loved humanity too much to accept its mediocrity. In the 21st century, we are living in the ultimate practico-inert, trapped in systems we created but can't control. The global economy, the climate crisis, the algorithms that feed us outrage. And we feel that same seriality he described, that sense of being powerless numbers in a line waiting for a bus that might never come. Sartre's diagnosis of our sickness is perfect, even if his prescription of Marxist revolution was flawed, because he understood that the ultimate enemy is the feeling that there is no alternative, the belief that the system is a force of nature that we just have to accept. He screams at us from the grave that the system is us, that we are sustaining it every day by our passivity, and that the group infusion is always possible if we dare to look at our neighbour not as a threat, but as a potential ally in the struggle for freedom. This brings us to the surprisingly tender ethical turn of his final years, where he began to move away from the conflict model of human relations towards an ethics of generosity and gift-giving, realizing that true freedom isn't just about rebelling against the father, but about caring for the brother. He started to see that hell is other people was only true if relationships were based on domination, but if they were based on a mutual recognition of freedom, like his relationship with Beauvoir or the ideal of the city of ends, then the other could be the source of salvation, the mirror in which we see our own freedom reflected and amplified. This is the missing piece of existentialism that he was trying to articulate in his dying days with Benny Levy, a vision of fraternity that wasn't based on blood or soil, but on a shared commitment to a future where no one is left behind. It's a tragic irony that the man who wrote so brilliantly about the crushing weight of the gaze ended his life blind, unable to see the world that judged him, yet in that darkness he found a new kind of vision, a hope that went beyond the grim machinery of history. He leaves us with the uncomfortable question, are we just useless passions, striving in vain to be God, as he wrote in Being and Nothingness? Or is there a way to build a human community that doesn't crush the individual? He never solved this puzzle, but he died trying, leaving the pieces on the floor for us to pick up. As we prepare for the final curtain call of this series, we have to look at the Sartre experience as a whole, the philosophy, the politics, the literature, and the man, and ask what remains valid for us today. We are not going to judge him by a scorecard of his right and wrong political predictions, because that's too easy. Instead, we are going to judge him by the intensity of the challenge he throws at our feet. He is the unwanted guest at the dinner party of the 21st century, the one who drinks too much, smokes in the house, and asks the rude questions that ruin the mood, asking us, are you really living, or are you just typing? In the final part, we will summarise the Sartrean toolkit for the modern age, a survival guide for the existentialist in the digital era, and say our final goodbye to the cross-eyed king of chaos, who taught us that even in the darkest prison, we are condemned to be free. So here we are at the end of the road, standing metaphorically at the grave in Montparnasse, looking down at the simple stone that covers the man who tried to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the Sartrean survival guide for the 21st century, and why does this chain-smoking, wall-eyed philosopher matter to you right now, as you sit behind a screen in a world that feels like it's spinning out of control? The answer is that Sartre is the only antidote we have to the three great diseases of our modern age: the victim mentality, the curated life, and the algorithmic drift. First, in a culture that encourages us to define ourselves by our trauma, our conditions and our limitations, telling us that we are toxic or broken or oppressed by forces we can't control, Sartre offers the terrifying, liberating red pill of radical responsibility, grabbing us by the collar and shouting that while we cannot control what happens to us, we are 100% responsible for how we react to it, meaning that every second you spend blaming your parents or the system is a second you are wasting your power to change the script. Second, in the age of Instagram and TikTok, where we spend our lives performing a fake version of ourselves for the gaze of strangers, terrified of being cancelled or ignored, Sartre provides the weapon of authenticity, warning us that if we define ourselves by how others see us, we are nothing but objects, waiters playing a role, and that the only way to be real is to smash the mirror and act according to our own conscience, even if it makes us unpopular or weird. And third, in a world where algorithms predict what we want to buy, watch and date before we even know it ourselves, trying to turn us into predictable data points, Sartre reminds us that we are undefined, that consciousness is a wild, chaotic nothingness that can never be fully captured by a computer code, because we always have the power to say no, to swerve, to do the unexpected, and to reinvent ourselves in the blink of an eye. The lesson of his refusal of the Nobel Prize wasn't just about literary politics. It was a masterclass in refusing to be branded, a refusal to let the establishment turn you into a statue while you're still alive, teaching us that we should never let a job title, a salary, or an award define our worth, because the moment you think I have arrived, you are dead. He teaches us that anguish isn't a disorder to be medicated away, but the dizzying sensation of our own potential, the feeling of standing at the helm of a ship with no map, realizing that we are the captain, the navigator, and the engine all at once. It is scary, yes, but it is better than being a passenger on a ship that is going nowhere. Sartre was wrong about Stalin, he was wrong about the Cultural Revolution, and he was often a terrible boyfriend, but he was right about the one thing that matters most: that you are free, terrifyingly, beautifully, absolutely free. He didn't leave us a set of commandments to follow because that would be bad faith. Instead, he left us a toolkit of questions to cut through the noise. Are you lying to yourself? What are you doing with your freedom? Who are you when no one is watching? He is the virus of liberty that, once it enters your system, makes it impossible to ever look at your life the same way again. Because you can no longer say, I had no choice, without knowing, deep down, that you are lying. The Sartre century was a time of blood and ink, but the Sartre moment is happening right now, inside your head, as you realize that the story of your life isn't written in the stars, or in your DNA, or in your history. It is a blank page waiting for you to pick up the pen. He was the man who refused the Nobel Prize because he wanted to remain a man, not a monument. And in doing so, he gave us the greatest prize of all, the knowledge that existence precedes essence, which is just a fancy way of saying that you are not what you were yesterday. You are what you do next. So, as we leave the smoke-filled cafes of Paris and step back into the blinding light of the present, don't look for Sartre in the history books. Look for him in the mirror the next time you have a hard choice to make, and remember the little man who challenged the gods and won, not by being perfect, but by being relentlessly, unapologetically human. The play is not over, the curtain has not fallen, and the stage is yours. Jean-Paul Sartre has left the building, but he left the door open for you to walk through it.